Hey guys, tonight we're slipping behind the velvet curtains of history's grandest bedrooms, into places where candlelight flickers on polished gold, shadows stretch across damask walls, and whispered secrets echo louder than royal decrees. But let's not romanticize it too fast. This is not the Netflix version of palace life. Nope, you're about to find out that sex in royal palaces, it's rarely private, often political, occasionally bizarre, and if we're being honest, pretty drafty. Now before we go any further, reality check. You probably won't survive this. Not emotionally, not socially, and definitely not if you try to get cozy with someone above your station. Royal intimacy wasn't just a personal affair, it was public theatre, wrapped in duty, tradition, paranoia, and about 17 layers of lace. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your city and what time it is where you're watching. I want to know if you're listening to this while the sun rises in Oslo, or the moon hangs low over Manila. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The room is colder than you expect. Palaces, especially those in Northern Europe, aren't insulated for comfort. Stone walls, soaring ceilings, and grand windows let in more chill than warmth. You're not snuggled in a cosy boudoir, you're pacing a chamber meant to impress visitors, not cradle intimacy. There's a fireplace, sure, but it crackles more with ceremony than actual heat. You're wrapped in brocade, not blankets, and somewhere outside your chamber door, at least 3 people know what you're about to do. Royal bedrooms aren't private in the way we understand privacy today. There are guards posted just beyond the door, valets, maids, and pages stationed in connecting rooms. Some even sleep just steps away in case you call. The bed itself might sit on a raised platform. It might have curtains, but they don't always stay drawn. And depending on the time period, you might not even be alone during your most intimate moment. That's right. In many royal traditions, especially in medieval and early modern Europe, consummating a royal marriage was considered a matter of state. That means someone, somewhere, had to confirm it happened. Sometimes this meant a trusted attendant would wait outside the bedroom door listening carefully. Sometimes it meant physically inspecting the sheets in the morning. And in the most awkward cases, it meant standing in the room while it happened. Picture that. You're in bed, maybe nervous, maybe 20 years old, maybe never been this close to someone romantically. And there's your uncle's advisor nodding solemnly from a nearby chair. Not exactly a romantic ambiance. But even when you're alone, the palace isn't exactly set up for quiet intimacy. Candles flicker in wrought iron sconces. You can smell wax, perfume, and damp wool. Somewhere, a mouse scurries behind a tapestry. The bed creaks loudly, not just because it's old, but because it's enormous and built more for display than comfort. The sheets, maybe silk, maybe not. Depending on the era and country, even royals didn't always have luxurious bedding. In Tudor England, for example, linens were changed infrequently, and chamber pots sat just feet from the bed. You lie there and try to get in the mood, but every sound outside the door feels like a ghost. The court gossips are already whispering. The pressure to perform, to conceive, to be adequate as a partner and ruler, it's intense. Your spouse, maybe they're a stranger. Maybe they speak a different language. Maybe they're terrified too. Maybe they're older than your father. And yet you're expected to rise to the occasion. Because this isn't just sex, it's succession. The continuation of a dynasty, a merger of empires. Your body isn't entirely your own, it's a national asset. This one act is supposed to secure alliances, produce heirs, and ideally, make you fall in love. No pressure. And let's not forget the clothes. In many eras, undressing wasn't quick. Corsets, laces, sleeves, garters, chemises. It was a multi-step process involving layers and assistance. There's a decent chance someone helped undress you, then stood nearby while you climbed into bed. Think about that. The transition from courtly gown to naked vulnerability wasn't smooth or sexy. It was theatrical. It was often supervised. It was at best awkward. But not all palaces were cold and not all royals were joyless. In the Mughal palaces of India, for instance, architecture emphasised warmth, sensuality and lush surroundings. Courtyards opened to moonlit baths. Scented oils filled the air. Silk pillows and cool marble floors made pleasure seem more attainable. Still, even in these more luxurious settings, hierarchy and duty ruled the bedroom. One quirky little detail. In some French courts, the royal bed wasn't just for sleeping or sex, it was a literal stage. Courtiers would gather in the morning to watch the monarch wake, dress, and occasionally share a meal in bed. Sometimes even a favourite mistress would be seen slipping out, causing murmurs and raised fans. You were always being watched, even in sleep. And here's a little debated nugget. Historians still argue about how much physical intimacy between royals was genuine desire versus ceremonial obligation. Did Louis XIV truly love his many mistresses? Was Catherine the Great's famed appetite a political slander or a truth exaggerated through gossip? Scholars dig through letters, diaries and second-hand reports trying to separate fact from flourish. But in a world where privacy barely existed, we may never really know. So as you lie in this vast royal bed, with the chill biting your nose and duty pressing down heavier than the velvet canopy, you start to wonder, was this really worth it? Is power ever sexy when it comes with so many strings? And how much more bearable would this all be if you could just lock the door? So you're lying there in this cavernous bed, trying not to shiver, trying not to think about the valet who's probably eavesdropping behind the curtain, and maybe, just maybe, trying to feel the tiniest flicker of excitement about the person beside you. But before anything intimate even happens, you're expected to go through a whole series of weird little rituals. Because in royal palaces, nothing ever happens spontaneously, not even passion. First up, hygiene, or let's say their best approximation of it. If you're imagining a soothing bath with candlelight and rose petals, try again. Royal bathing habits varied wildly depending on time and region, but many European nobles were famously suspicious of too much bathing. In fact, some believed that water opened the pores and let disease sneak in. So instead of bathing regularly, many royals masked body odour with heavy perfume, lavender sachets, or by changing their underclothes, assuming they remembered to do that. Your preparation might involve having your body lightly dusted with rice powder or musk, your breath freshened with wine-soaked herbs, or your wig recurled with hot tongs that smell faintly of scorched hair, that is, if you're lucky. More often than not, you're stepping into bed slightly sweaty, covered in layers of fabric residue, and carrying the weight of your court's expectations like a lead cloak. And that's just physical preparation. Mentally, you've been primed since birth to view sex as either sacred or strategic. Depending on where and when you are, you might have prayed before entering the bedchamber. In 17th century Catholic courts, confessors often instructed newlyweds to ask for divine blessing before consummation. Some took this very seriously, turning what should have been a tender moment into something tinged with guilt and obligation. But it wasn't all doom and incense. Some courts leaned into sensuality in a big way. Think Ottoman harems, where rituals were designed to prolong anticipation. You might be bathed in rosewater, massaged with perfumed oils, dressed in embroidered silk, and taught the art of teasing glances. There was a whole system to it, ritual, choreography and anticipation, all culminating in a delicate balance of performance and pleasure. That said, the women in these spaces weren't always free agents. Concubines, consorts and even favoured wives often had to compete for affection like courtiers battling over policy. And let's not ignore astrology. Yeah, that's right. Before slipping between those embroidered sheets, some royals consulted the stars. Court astrologers were often asked to determine the most auspicious day and hour for conceiving an heir. If the moon wasn't in the right house, better wait until Thursday. One French nobleman once refused to sleep with his wife for an entire month because Mars was misaligned. You can imagine how well that went over. Speaking of pressure, this whole moment is probably being reported somewhere. In some courts, especially during royal weddings, officials would log the date and time of consummation. Why? Because if there were any future disputes over heirs, everyone wanted receipts. In England, during the Tudor era, nobles could be summoned to sign declarations that the marriage had been fulfilled, even if they weren't present to witness it. Rumours still buzz around the question of whether Henry VIII's marriage to Anne of Cleves was truly consummated, or if he just found her unattractive and made up an excuse to wiggle out of it. Spoiler, the official records don't help much. Meanwhile, you've got people nervously pacing the outer chambers, waiting for news. Maids are prepared to gather the linens in the morning, looking for proof in the form of blood. Midwives might even be summoned weeks later to evaluate the bride's body for signs of activity. It's surveillance, not seduction. And here's the kicker, many of these rituals were less about the couple and more about the public. In early medieval France and parts of Spain, the royal marriage wasn't considered complete until the bride was undressed and led to the bed by female witnesses, while male witnesses escorted the groom. They didn't stay for the act, that they waited outside and everyone expected to hear something, movement, laughter, maybe even applause. If you have ever had stage fright, imagine that, but with a kingdom's future at stake. Now let's zoom out a bit and touch on a lesser known but deeply odd tradition, the fertility relics. In certain Catholic courts, childless royals were encouraged to sleep with sacred objects nearby, bones of saints, vials of holy oil, or even letters believed to be written by apostles. One Spanish queen allegedly kept a finger bone under her pillow, hoping for divine intervention. The effectiveness, questionable, the creep factor, off the charts. Of course, historians argue about how seriously these rituals were taken. Some suggest they were more symbolic, a kind of ceremonial insurance policy. Others believe that these practices genuinely reflected the deep-seated fears and hopes of royalty, especially when dynasties hung by a thread. After all, if you couldn't produce an heir, everything, titles, alliances, even peace treaties could fall apart. And let's not ignore the emotional toll. Behind all the pomp and perfume, you're a person being asked to blend desire with diplomacy. You might be young and terrified. You might be older and tired of playing the game. You might feel nothing at all for the person beside you. And yet the rituals carry on. Powders are dabbed, prayers are whispered, and sheets are drawn back like curtains on a stage. Because in royal palaces, sex wasn't just a private act, it was theatre, it was destiny. So as the last candle guttered low and the velvet bed curtains closed around your shared space, you didn't get a moment of peace. You got a carefully choreographed ceremony. Part magic, part performance, part bureaucracy, all in the name of a future you didn't get to write. Now imagine the curtain is barely drawn. The embers are fading in the fireplace and you're finally mercifully alone, or so you think. But just as your hand grazes the edge of your partner's robe, there's the faintest sound. A shuffle, a breath, maybe even a cough. Because in a royal palace you are never really alone. Not in your bedroom, not in your bath, and definitely not during your most vulnerable moments. Welcome to the unnerving world of bedchamber witnesses, personal attendants, and lurking eyes whose entire job was to hover as close to your intimacy as etiquette would allow. Some of these witnesses were purely symbolic. In certain traditions, nobles would simply escort the newlyweds to bed and toast to their union before politely exiting. But in others, especially among the Tudors, Habsburgs and Bourbons, bedchamber staff didn't just hover nearby. They slept in adjacent rooms, sometimes with direct access through an open doorway or curtained archway. Even when you thought you were alone, there was usually someone within whispering distance, just in case you needed fresh sheets, a glass of wine, or, say, help confirming an heir was underway. And these weren't just anonymous maids or faceless footmen. Many were trusted confidants, nobles in their own right, or long-time family servants who had grown up alongside the monarch. They had names, titles, and way too much information. The gentleman of the bedchamber in British courts, for example, was a nobleman who might help the king dress, undress, and stay nearby in case of urgent needs. It wasn't necessarily sexual, it was about power, proximity and tradition, but it still created an atmosphere where nothing was ever entirely private. Imagine being expected to get frisky while your childhood tutor listens for movement just outside the door. And then there were the ladies in waiting. These women weren't just decoration or companions, they were embedded surveillance. Often tasked with managing the Queen's wardrobe, health and moral purity, they could double as unofficial spies for kings or rival courtiers. If a queen was suspected of infidelity, or even just affection for the wrong person, her ladies might be questioned, bribed or pressured to report. A sideways glance, a missed period, or a night spent crying into a pillow could all trigger whispered reports and veiled threats. They weren't just ladies, they were a living, breathing rumour mill with corsets and sharp ears. One of the more bizarre court traditions came from France, where the king's daily routine, including bedtime, was partially public. The lever and coucher ceremonies involved courtiers watching the king wake and go to bed. High-ranking nobles might even be honoured with the privilege of helping him undress or tuck him in. Sure, that sounds innocent enough, but when it's layered with centuries of court politics, it becomes more theatre than routine. Sex in this world wasn't something you disappeared for, it was something everyone tracked. There's even a case from 18th century Austria where the Empress Maria Theresa kept detailed records of her children's marital activities, including what time they went to bed and whether all went well. Not out of prurience, but because producing heirs was a state concern. She reportedly sent midwives, priests, and even her own attendants to check in. Romantic, right? This constant observation created a strange paradox. Royals lived surrounded by luxury but utterly stripped of intimacy. They had everything: soft pillows, warm fires, gold-threaded robes, but never true privacy. Every whisper had an audience. Every moan might be heard. Every decision, whether it involved silk sheets or forbidden lovers, could end up in a letter to a rival court. And then there's the truly strange: some royal couples were legally required to prove consummation in front of witnesses. One of the most infamous cases, the marriage of Margaret Tudor, sister of Henry VIII, to James IV of Scotland. Several noblemen reportedly accompanied the couple to their chamber and waited awkwardly outside until they were certain the deed was done. In some cases, priests were present to bless the act, or worse, observe it. Though most of these reports are second-hand and dramatised, the fact that people believed it happened says enough. One quirky detail: in Scandinavian courts, a tradition known as the bedding ceremony involved newlyweds being undressed, dressed by their respective entourages, kissed goodnight by onlookers, and then tucked into the bed, often with an audience watching from the shadows. These ceremonies were half pagan, half political, and 100% nightmare fuel if you were shy. But not all surveillance was direct. Sometimes it was architectural. Palaces were built with secret passageways, spy holes, and one-way doors. In places like Hampton Court or Fontainebleau, certain corridors allowed staff and occasionally enemies to move unseen between bedrooms, galleries, and meeting rooms. If someone wanted to know who visited your chamber late at night, they didn't need a guard. They needed a secret staircase. Historians still debate how much of this was real versus exaggerated. Some scholars argue that the most invasive customs faded by the 10th century, replaced by more symbolic gestures. Others believe the culture of surveillance remained deeply entrenched, just hidden behind layers of etiquette and ritual. Either way, the result was the same: an atmosphere of constant tension, where passion lived under the microscope and privacy was a fleeting illusion. For royals, sex was never just about desire. It was always entangled with politics, duty, and reputation. And when you're never alone, when eyes and ears follow your every move, it's no wonder so many monarchs turn to secret lovers, hidden letters, and midnight rendezvous. Because even kings and queens need a moment that belongs only to them. So you lie there in your gilded bed, the curtains drawn, the fire low, your breathing barely audible. And somewhere in the dark, a servant shifts their weight on the stone floor, a page scribbles in a ledger, and the walls, those opulent, echoing walls, listen. It's one thing to say royal sex was political, but what that really means comes sharply into focus when you learn that sometimes people were expected to perform it like a contract signing, with all the formality and none of the spontaneity. Because in the glittering world of crowns and coronets, consummation wasn't just encouraged, it was required, recorded, and occasionally witnessed by a roomful of officials. Seriously, you're expected to prove your marriage is legit, not just with a wedding ring, but with physical confirmation. Welcome to the truly uncomfortable realm of publicly verified sex. Take a deep breath, because this is the part where your body is no longer your own. It's a tool of diplomacy now. You've just married into a powerful house, maybe Habsburg, maybe Bourbon, maybe a Scandinavian dynasty with too many consonants, and your union represents the fusion of two nations, two fortunes, or two bloody centuries of political feuding. Everyone's watching. Well, not during, hopefully, but what happens behind your bed curtains will have ripple effects across the continent. In some especially intrusive traditions, the newlyweds were escorted by a full entourage to the bedroom. The bedding ceremony wasn't symbolic fluff, it was serious business. In medieval and early modern England, France and Scotland, officials actually accompanied the couple to bed. A bishop might stand at the foot of the bed and bless the union. Witnesses, usually high-ranking nobles or close family members, would stay nearby, sometimes in the same room until they heard the appropriate noises. Some might offer wine, others just stared at the ceiling in mortified silence. Whatever the ritual specifics, the message was clear. This isn't just romance. It's your duty to make heirs, and we're here to make sure you don't mess it up. If that sounds traumatic, you're not alone in thinking so. Even historical chroniclers found it awkward. There are accounts of royal couples so terrified of the performance that they simply lay side by side and whispered into the dark, pretending. Others, pressured by hovering witnesses, would rush the act homeless, just to get it over with. In one French case, a noble wrote that the bride trembled so much during her public bedding that she had to be physically held down by her maid until the audience left the room, and if there was no audience inside the room, the pressure didn't vanish. In many cases, attendants or court physicians examined the bed linens the next morning for signs of consummation, often meaning blood. This, of course, relied on a flawed and frankly misogynistic assumption that all virgin women bleed during sex, and that men would always perform without issue. If the sheets didn't prove the act had happened, the couple might be interrogated, separated, or even annulled. But what if the act didn't happen? What if the groom couldn't perform? What if the bride was unwilling? In most cases, the blame fell squarely on the woman. She might be accused of coldness, witchcraft, or failing in her wifely duty. In Spain and France, kings who couldn't consummate often had their marriages annulled, after humiliating public hearings, where doctors and theologians speculated on the exact nature of the royal failure. Imagine being 17 years old and hearing a group of grey-bearded men argue about whether your hips were wide enough for childbirth. One of the most bizarre cases of performative consummation occurred in the 17th century, during the marriage of Marie-Louise of Orléans to Charles II of Spain. Charles, famously fragile and likely infertile due to generations of inbreeding, was expected to produce an heir. When he failed, Marie-Louise was blamed. She was examined, interrogated, and eventually died, likely from stress and illness, after years of public scrutiny. Her womb, they claimed, had failed the Spanish crown. There's also the disturbing case of the 1581 marriage between French royal Marguerite de Valois and Henry of Navarre. Their wedding night was reportedly so important that Marguerite's own mother, Catherine de' Medici, demanded confirmation. In her memoirs, Marguerite hinted that servants and officials lingered outside the door while the couple tried, awkwardly, to obey. No pressure, right? But these public confirmations weren't just about fertility. They were also legal insurance. If a king or queen wanted to annul a marriage, they had to prove it hadn't been consummated. That meant any rumours, any doubt, any claim of impotence or reluctance could explode into a full-blown scandal. Lawyers, clerics, and physicians would be summoned. Letters would be unearthed. Servants would be interrogated. One failed night in bed could bring down a marriage, and sometimes a dynasty. Now, not every royal court went to such creepy extremes. In places like Ming China, sex was still political, but far more private. Emperors had dozens, sometimes hundreds of concubines, and a complex system of scheduling who would spend the night in the imperial bed. These encounters were logged but rarely observed. That said, even here, a concubine's fertility, or lack thereof, could determine her fate. If she bore an heir, her status skyrocketed. If not, she might vanish into obscurity, or worse. In contrast, Japanese imperial courts valued refinement and subtlety. Passion was hinted at through poetry, robes, and incense. But even in these more romanticised traditions, producing heirs remained a silent, looming pressure. And servants, silent and ever-present, still knew more than anyone was comfortable admitting. One fascinating but lesser-known tradition: in some German principalities, newlyweds had to complete a witnessed undressing. A pair of trusted relatives would stay just long enough to make sure the couple got into bed together. No one stayed for the act, thankfully, but they were required to report back to the court. If either spouse refused, it was grounds for annulment. It sounds absurd now, but for a few hundred years, it was common practice. Historians still debate how often these rituals were actually enforced. Some suggest the most extreme versions were rare, reserved for especially important unions. Others argue that they were widespread but stylized, meant more to intimidate than actually verify. Either way, the sheer fact that kings and queens had to prove their sex lives speaks volumes. You, lying under those heavy tapestries, feel none of the heat and all of the weight. This isn't just a personal experience, it's a diplomatic mission with body parts. One misstep and your lineage, your land, your honour could unravel. The stakes are high, the audience is waiting, and somewhere someone is already writing down what they think happened tonight, whether they were in the room or not. The moment you reach for each other under the canopy of brocade, a fresh complication reveals itself: furniture. Specifically, the royal bed. It's not just a bed, it's a throne in disguise, a stage, a symbol, and a colossal creaky structure that's more about being seen than slept in. This thing has 4 towering posts, layers of embroidered hangings, a frame carved with family crests, and enough velvet to smother a lesser noble. You don't just climb into it, you ascend. And that sets the tone for what's about to happen. Even in intimacy, you're still performing a role. The royal bed was never built for comfort. Its sheer height meant that you'd need a footstool or even a stepladder to get in. Some monarchs, particularly in France and England, had beds so elevated and ornate they were basically ceremonial furniture. Louis XIV's bed at Versailles. That thing had its own daily ritual. Courtiers gathered to watch him wake up, get dressed, and even be tucked in. So while you might want to imagine a cosy night of quiet connection, you're actually dealing with a mattress that groans like a sea ship, sheets that scratch like sandpaper, and a physical space engineered to impress guests, not cradle lovers. And let's not overlook the logistics of fashion. You're wearing 5, maybe 6 layers of clothing. Your corset requires untying, your stockings need rolling down, and your outer dress is so wide it has its own gravitational field. Your partner, meanwhile, is wrapped in an embroidered nightshirt, maybe even a wig, and possibly armed with a dagger out of habit. Undressing is an ordeal that requires planning, patience, and at least one maid with nimble fingers. Spontaneity? Unlikely. By the time you're both disrobed, the candles have burned halfway down, and your enthusiasm has probably cooled with the night air. Still, once you're both finally under the covers, or more realistically, under separate layers of linen, wool, and decorative throws, you're faced with another issue: protocol. Sex between royals was governed by unwritten but deeply understood rules. Certain positions were considered improper. Others were seen as too wild, too animalistic, or worse, common. In many courts, the missionary position was seen as the only acceptable one for procreation. Anything else risks scandal if discovered. It sounds absurd now, but even your body's angles could be subject to scrutiny if the wrong servant walked in or the wrong rumour got out. In more conservative courts, even kissing could be a calculated act. You kiss to greet, to show favour, to submit. But passionate kissing in bed? That might be seen as lower class. Some historians argue that sensuality, actual pleasure, was considered vulgaire if it interfered with duty. For example, in 17th century England, letters between nobles reveal a subtle disdain for couples who were too affectionate, as if love itself was a sign of poor discipline. And this discomfort wasn't just social, it was physical. Royal beds, especially in winter, were freezing. Heating was inconsistent, and palace walls were more for grandeur than insulation. You might share the bed, but you'd both be swaddled in separate linens, sometimes even wearing nightcaps or gloves. The idea of warm, bare skin or pressing against warm, bare skin? More fantasy than reality. You'd likely be fumbling in the dark, trying not to elbow a priceless pillow off the bed, or accidentally tug a curtain too hard and bring down half the canopy. Now imagine all this awkward choreography playing out while you're expected to maintain dignity. That meant no laughing, no fumbling, and definitely no talking about what went wrong. If something was clumsy or painful or hilariously off-key, you didn't acknowledge it. You acted like it was fine. You behaved as though it was noble, because losing composure, especially in the presence of a spouse you barely knew, was almost worse than not performing at all. In the Ottoman Empire, however, there was a bit more flair. The Sultan's sleeping quarters, like those at Topkapi Palace, were elaborate but intentionally sensual. They had padded floors, reclining lounges, and domed ceilings designed to amplify soft music or the trickling sounds of fountains. Furniture was more flexible, more inviting. Still, even there, every movement within the royal harem was documented, logged, and subject to protocol. Concubines didn't just wander in for a cuddle. They were summoned, examined, and often pre-approved by eunuchs who served as gatekeepers of intimacy. Back in Europe, even the smallest furniture piece could reflect your marital status and bedroom expectations. Take the marriage chair, a special seat gifted to newlyweds in parts of France and Italy, often with carved scenes of Adam and Eve or scenes from mythology. It was meant to inspire, or, depending on the imagery, intimidate. Other bedrooms had symbolic items like fertility statues, elaborate bedpans, and privacy screens that served more as decoration than barriers. Even your surroundings reminded you constantly that you weren't just lovers, you were symbols. Here's one of those delightfully odd fringe facts. In the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, newlyweds were sometimes gifted a bed clock, a timekeeping device meant to track their nights together. It was mostly symbolic, but it's hard to shake the image of some poor couple lying there, ticking seconds off under the gaze of a judgmental gilded cuckoo. And of course, scholars continue to debate what these royal bedroom dynamics actually felt like to the people involved. Was it emotionally barren? Or did couples find ways to connect in the margins of protocol? Some say that within the stiff rules, there was room for real affection. Others believe it was a lonely world, where physical closeness never quite melted the walls between two people raised to see love as political currency. So there you are, knees awkwardly bent on a squeaky bed built like a fortress, trying to maneuver through layers of silk while maintaining regal posture and wondering if your partner knows what they're doing any better than you do. You shift. The mattress lets out a groan like a dying elk. One of the tassels brushes your shoulder like an unwanted third wheel. Somewhere a clock chimes midnight, and you still haven't figured out where your feet are supposed to go. You might think, after the rituals, the awkward furniture, the icy silence and the looming pressure to perform like a monarch on stage, that at least the moment of undressing would be a reprieve. An intimate pause where two people disarm, disrobe, and get just a little closer. But, oh no, in royal palaces even getting undressed was a production. A slow, ceremonial, sometimes maddening process wrapped in lace, laced with anxiety, and padded with more cloth than a tent at a Renaissance fair. For starters, you're not undressing yourself. That would be barbaric. You have attendants for that, trained ones. In fact, entire roles at court were designated for the dressing and undressing of royals. In France, there was the valet de chambre, or femme de chambre, depending on your gender. These were the hands that tied your ribbons, fastened your bodice, and gently removed your wig without knocking over your powdered curls like a top-heavy ice cream cone. And if it's your wedding night, oh, get ready for an audience. In some traditions, the undressing of the bride was done ceremonially, in front of senior ladies of the court, who would offer whispered advice, good wishes, and sometimes unsolicited commentary about childbearing hips or lucky birthmarks. They'd help unlace your gown, peel away the corset, remove stockings one by one, and then send you off in a white shift with instructions not to wrinkle it, because your husband still had to remove that final layer. Romantic. Meanwhile, your new royal spouse is across the hall undergoing a similar process. His waistcoat is being tugged off by gentlemen of his chamber, his boots pulled off by someone who probably outranks half the nobility in your home village. His cravat is untied with the solemnity of a priest handling sacred relics. And when he's finally down to his linen nightshirt, someone might offer him a glass of spiced wine or, in especially awkward cases, a little encouragement. Because yes, people talk about your nerves, about your readiness, about the weight of your responsibility, all while you're trying not to trip over your own nightgown. By the time the two of you meet at the bed, neither of you has had a single private moment to prepare. You're both slightly chilled, slightly overwhelmed, and trying very hard not to look like you just had 4 people help you take off your socks. And the layers, oh the layers, just because you've been undressed doesn't mean you're naked. Royal nightwear wasn't made for seduction. It was made for modesty and insulation. Women wore long chemises or shifts, often with sleeves. Men wore linen nightshirts that reached their knees, sometimes tied at the neck. You might even be wearing a bed cap, like some sort of sexually nervous Victorian ghost. And if you think the undressing ended there, think again. One layer down was just the beginning. Corsets might remain partially fastened. Stockings were sometimes left on. Jewellery had to be carefully removed and placed on designated trays. Even undergarments might still be tucked around your waist. Depending on your rank, the customs of your court, and how scandalised your attendants were by the idea of you being truly bare beneath your bedsheets. But sometimes all those layers were part of the game. At Versailles, where appearance was everything and the line between power and flirtation was razor thin, even the act of undressing could become flirtatious performance. A well-timed glance during the loosening of a garter. A shared chuckle as a wig came off askew. Some couples, especially ones with pre-existing attraction, used the ritual as a slow burn, teasing the final reveal while the court pretended not to watch from behind the embroidered walls. In other courts, like those of 18th century Russia, the process was brisker, less ceremonial. But even then, layers still ruled the night. Russian winters meant sleeping in clothing, often side by side under fur throws thick enough to muffle both sound and movement. Getting undressed wasn't about anticipation, it was about practicality and not freezing to death before the first kiss. And for all this ceremonial effort, no one ever really taught royal couples how to do anything once the clothes were off. Formal education? Not really. Explicit guidance? Mostly absent. You might have gotten vague advice from a confessor or an aunt with questionable metaphors. But actual knowledge that had to be pieced together from rumours, illustrations, or awkward trial and error. The idea was that nobility shouldn't need to be taught such things, you'd just know, which of course made the moment even more daunting. Quirky sidebar. In some courts, the bed itself was rigged with rope systems to help lift or arrange the mattresses and bedclothes. These pulley beds were designed more for function than intimacy, but the creaking of those ropes could be unmistakable. There's at least one recorded account of a Scottish nobleman becoming so embarrassed by the sound of the bed ropes during his wedding night that he climbed out of bed and spent the night pacing in the hall instead. Scholars still debate whether the undressing rituals were truly meant to be erotic, or whether they were just another way for the court to intrude on what should have been private. Some argue that the performance of modesty was more important than actual modesty. Others suggest that the ceremony was meant to strip the individuals of their autonomy, turning them into extensions of the monarchy, even in their most intimate moments. So there you are, finally lying in bed, still wearing half a shift, your spouse tugging at a stubborn ribbon, the air thick with perfume, wax and unspoken tension. You're aware of every inch of cloth between you, every sound that might drift out into the corridor, every servant who helped you get to this moment and might now be holding their breath behind the door. And as you finally begin to reach for each other, you realise that in a palace, even nakedness isn't simple. It's layered, it's watched, it's choreographed, and no matter how much you want to melt into someone's arms, the shape of your body beneath the sheets still belongs, just a little, to the estate. At some point, after the layers are peeled away, the ceremony winds down and the bed stops groaning like a haunted ship. You begin to think, maybe now, finally, you can just be two people. But if you happen to be doing this at Versailles, in the 17th or 18th century, you'd better think again, because this isn't just a royal bedroom. It's the epicentre of one of the most flamboyant, scandal-riddled, seduction-obsessed courts in European history. And here, sex isn't just personal. It's performance art, weapon, and pastime, all wrapped in satin and powdered hair. Welcome to the world of French court love, where mistresses had titles, gossip had structure, and seduction was as carefully choreographed as a minuet. You're not just navigating your own marriage anymore. You're entering a world where power is traded through glances, letters, perfumes, and late-night visits behind panel walls. It's equal parts dangerous and delicious. Let's start with the basics. At Versailles, being a royal mistress was practically a job title. In fact, the role was so established that there was a term for the official one, maîtresse en titre. She had apartments in the palace, staff, carriages, and access to the king at all hours. She also had enemies, many of them, but her influence was undeniable. A successful mistress could sway foreign policy, get her relatives promoted, and introduce artists and poets into the royal circle, and it all started with a single look across a ballroom. You might assume mistresses were hidden away like shameful secrets. Nope. They were seated in prominent boxes at the opera. They rode in royal carriages. They were painted in portraits wearing nothing but pearls and confidence. Madame de Pompadour, the most famous mistress of Louis XV, wasn't just his lover. She was his political advisor, art patron, and personal confidant. After their physical relationship cooled, she still remained at court, managing his correspondence and recommending new mistresses to replace her. Yes, that was considered tasteful. And this wasn't a French quirk. Many European courts followed suit, though few did it with quite the same flair. In England, royal mistresses were often less formalised but equally powerful. Nell Gwynn, the beloved mistress of Charles II, was famous for her wit and her humble beginnings, an actress who rose through charm and cleverness. She once reportedly referred to herself as the Protestant whore, just to poke fun at her Catholic rivals. And that irreverent humour? The king adored it. But Versailles was the gold standard of seduction. It wasn't just about beauty, it was about strategy. Courtiers wrote love letters like treaties, using veiled metaphors and coded language to confess or conceal desire. The wrong phrase could ruin you. The right one could elevate your family for generations. And it didn't stop with letters. Lovers exchanged scented gloves, embroidered handkerchiefs, or gilded snuff boxes, each with hidden meanings. You weren't just gifting someone a trinket, you were starting a conversation beneath the surface of the court's formal smile. Perfume was practically its own language. Musk suggested desire. Orange blossom hinted at fidelity. Ambergris. That was the scent of daring, the one you wore if you wanted someone to remember your presence long after you'd left the room. At Versailles, you couldn't get close to anyone without smelling like a dream or a declaration. There's a fringe little fact that gets overlooked. Some royal mistresses published memoirs. Not in their lifetime, of course, but posthumously. Many of their letters and journals were released, painting a picture of court life that's equal parts breathtaking and bonkers. One anonymous mistress of a minor French duke described in detail how she had to rotate between 3 sets of lovers based on the phases of the moon, and claimed she did so on astrological advice. Whether true or not, it gives you a glimpse into just how bizarrely structured royal lust could be. All of this raises the obvious question. What about the Queen? Where does she fit into this fragrant mess of love notes and moonlight trysts? Well, that's where it gets complicated. Queens were expected to be dignified, dutiful and above the drama. But that didn't mean they were unaware. Some turned a blind eye, others fumed silently, and a rare few learned how to play the game themselves. Marie Antoinette, for example, knew all too well that mistresses had power. Though she never took one herself, at least not officially, she surrounded herself with flirtatious, fashionable companions and fueled rumours with her late-night parties and private gardens. The court gossips practically salivated over the idea that the Queen might be misbehaving, because in this world, scandal wasn't just news, it was currency. Of course, there were real consequences. If a royal mistress bore a child, things got messy. The child might be acknowledged, titled, even educated alongside legitimate heirs, or they might vanish into the care of a distant cousin and never be seen again. Sometimes mistresses became enemies of state, blamed for everything from bad harvests to foreign wars. Madame du Barry, another lover of Louis XV, was eventually executed during the French Revolution, though not because she loved too freely, but because she represented everything the public had come to hate about royal excess. And yet, for all the danger and politics, there was something undeniably magnetic about the seduction culture at Versailles. Sex here wasn't just biological or ceremonial, it was aesthetic. Sensuality was wrapped in lace and dipped in champagne. Even the architecture reflected it. Galleries designed for encounters, alcoves for whispering, mirrored walls to catch a lingering glance. If you wanted to seduce a monarch, you didn't need a perfect body. You needed wit, perfume, and a decent understanding of Latin puns. Historians still argue over whether the French court's openness about mistresses was progressive or oppressive. Some say it gave women a rare path to influence and self-determination. Others argue it reduced them to ornamental figures with short expiration dates. The truth probably lives somewhere in the middle, wrapped in a love letter, and hidden in a drawer where the ink has long since faded, but the scent still lingers. So tonight, in this golden room, heavy with perfume and candles, you lie there not just next to your spouse, but under the invisible shadow of someone else. Someone charming, clever, scented in jasmine and ambition, who once stood in this same space and whispered secrets into the same pillow. Their laughter still echoes in the corners, and their influence, though long gone, still hovers, like perfume in the air. You have now spent a few nights in this royal bedchamber, enough to realise that not all intimacy in the palace was sweet whispers and scented letters. Sometimes it was a cold transaction, sometimes it was a storm of passion in a gilded cage, and other times it was a tightrope walk between power and powerlessness. Nowhere was this more obvious than in the quiet, brutal distinction between the queen and the mistress, the woman who wore the crown and the woman who had the king's ear or his lips. The queen's role in most courts was never about love, it was about lineage, legitimacy and land. She was chosen like a treaty is signed, carefully, strategically and with the approval of half a dozen advisors and foreign ministers. Her body became a royal estate, with every attempt at pregnancy closely monitored and every childbirth announced like the launch of a new warship. Her job was to be dignified, obedient and fertile. Love, optional. Pleasure, not guaranteed. But just down the hall, or in some cases in the next bedchamber, there was another woman. She might not have a crown, but she had the king's attention. And more than that, she had freedom. Mistresses could laugh at court jokes, wear revealing gowns, debate poetry, even sip wine without being scolded. They could play where the queen was expected to pose. They could flirt. They could refuse. The queen couldn't even say no to her own husband without risking a diplomatic crisis. This strange double standard shaped everything in the palace. Imagine being that queen, lying in your ice-cold bed, while the court hums with rumours that the king has spent the night elsewhere, and worse, Imagine being expected to smile about it the next morning, to walk beside him at Mass, to host the mistress at your table, to raise your glass while the courtiers watch for the flicker of emotion behind your practiced smile. It happened all the time. In 18th century France, Queen Marie Leszczyńska, wife of Louis XV, was completely sidelined once Madame de Pompadour entered the picture. The Queen continued to fulfil her ceremonial role, but the King's romantic affections, his private laughter, and much of his political consultation went to his mistress. Pompadour even had a room directly above the King's private chambers, linked by a staircase. The Queen, meanwhile, lived in a separate wing, practically and symbolically distant. In England, Queen Caroline of Ansbach had to tolerate her husband George II's mistress, Henrietta Howard, even as the court praised Henrietta's charm and grace in the Queen's own presence. Caroline once reportedly quipped, "I don't mind him having a mistress, I just wish she were prettier." That may have been sarcasm, or it may have been her only outlet, because in royal marriages tolerance became a form of survival. But here's the twist. Mistresses were also at risk. Their position might have been glamorous, but it wasn't secure. The King's favour was fickle, and the court was ruthless. One wrong word, one misstep, and a mistress could fall from grace faster than a satin slipper down a marble staircase. She could be dismissed, exiled, even imprisoned. So while the Queen sat on her lonely throne, the mistress walked a tightrope over a pit of knives. And things got even more volatile when children entered the picture. If the Queen gave birth to an heir, her position was secure. If she failed to, the mistress's children might suddenly become pawns in dangerous political games. In some cases, royal bastards were given titles, lands, and even roles in succession lines, especially when the legitimate line looked shaky. Louis XIV acknowledged many of his illegitimate children, and some of them went on to become dukes, generals, even foreign diplomats. It infuriated traditionalists and thrilled ambitious mistresses who saw motherhood as their ultimate trump card. Of course, there were rare exceptions where queens found love, or at least amusement, outside their marriages. Catherine the Great of Russia had a string of lovers, some openly kept in luxurious apartments, others rotated out like royal appointments. Her court accepted it, even expected it, but she was the exception, not the rule. For most queens, the double standard remained ironclad. A king with lovers was virile. A queen with lovers was a threat. One bizarre but true tale comes from the court of Spain, where Queen Isabella II was rumoured to have taken multiple lovers due to her husband's widely suspected disinterest in women. While historians still debate the truth of those rumours, what stands out is how quickly whispers of a queen's sex life became state gossip, while a king's affairs were barely footnotes. Even more fascinating and more tragic are the documented friendships between queens and mistresses. Sometimes they got along, sometimes they even needed each other. Madame de Maintenon, for example, began her time at court as Louis XIV's mistress, and eventually became his secret wife, possibly even marrying him in a clandestine ceremony. She advised him on matters of state and morality, and maintained a respectful relationship with his children from previous relationships, the queen in that situation already dead. The coexistence of queen and mistress wasn't just a matter of etiquette, it was a dance of influence. Who sat closer at dinner? Who got the first look at the king's decrees? Who whispered in his ear before a major decision? The queen had the title, but the mistress had his attention, and sometimes that was worth more. Historians still argue about which role held more power. Was the queen's position, with all its constraints, actually more influential in the long run? Or did mistresses, in their fleeting reigns, have more sway over the monarch's heart, and therefore the direction of the kingdom? There's no clear answer, just layers of laced jealousy and calculated smiles. So tonight, as you sit in your bedchamber, you think about her, the other woman. Maybe you're the queen, rehearsing your smile for tomorrow's court appearance, or maybe you're the mistress, wondering how long the king will keep choosing your door over hers. Either way, the palace has made you two halves of a single fractured story, one official, one whispered, and both completely visible to everyone but yourselves. The moment you become royalty, whether by birth or by marriage, your body becomes a vessel, and not in some poetic hearts and flowers way. No, we're talking about a full-blown, state-monitored, fertility-mandated human womb with a crown situation. Because producing an heir isn't just a personal milestone, it's your number one job. Welcome to the unnerving world of royal fertility, where sex isn't just about desire or pleasure, it's about legacy, about dynasty, about cold clinical reproduction under pressure, sometimes without a shred of romance in sight. Let's not sugarcoat it. The pressure to conceive was brutal. The very survival of empires hung on whether or not a royal couple could manage to produce a healthy male baby, or a few spares, just in case. The minute your wedding veil comes off, you're no longer a blushing bride or a nervous groom. You are now, quite literally, a national investment, and the interest is due every month. Courts didn't wait patiently for baby news. Oh no. Everyone from advisors to midwives to your distant cousin twice removed had opinions. The Queen's menstruation, or lack thereof, became regular palace gossip. Miss a cycle, and half the court started knitting. Show signs of stress or fatigue, and servants exchanged glances in the hallways. If it turned out to be a false alarm, the disappointment was tangible, sometimes even recorded in official ledgers. And forget privacy. Royal pregnancies were public affairs from the second a bump appeared. In some courts, queens were expected to give birth in front of witnesses, yes, actual people standing nearby to ensure everything was done properly, and that no baby switching or air forging occurred. In France, the Queen's delivery room was often open to select members of the court. In England, it was a little more discreet, but not by much. In 1688, Queen Mary of Modena gave birth to James Francis Edward with more than 50 people present to confirm it was really her baby. So if you thought hospital delivery was stressful, imagine being in labour while 5 dukes and a cardinal hover at your bedside. The pressure wasn't just to conceive, it was to do it quickly, ideally within the first year of marriage. If no pregnancy appeared, royal couples were often subjected to medical evaluations, prayers, and, occasionally very awkward, bedroom interventions. Yes, that's exactly what it sounds like. Advisors suggesting changes to your technique, recommending herbs, or even sending in clergy to offer spiritual counselling. The idea of letting a couple figure things out privately? Not a thing. Sometimes the king would be blamed, sometimes the queen, but most often suspicion fell on the woman. She was the one whose body carried the baby, so if nothing was happening, clearly she must be at fault. Never mind if her husband was 70, syphilitic, or more interested in falconry than foreplay. The blame, more often than not, landed on the woman's lap, and her womb. That said, the royal obsession with fertility also led to some seriously strange practices. In early modern Europe, physicians and apothecaries whipped up an array of bizarre fertility potions. Ground deer antler, dried snake skin, powdered pearls, anything that sounded vaguely magical was fair game. Women were told to wear frog skins on their bellies. Men were instructed to drink fortified wine with bits of rhino horn. Spoiler alert, none of it worked, but it did make people feel like they were trying everything. And of course there were sex schedules, as in actual timetables for intercourse drawn up by court physicians who calculated the most fertile days and advised royal couples when to do their duty. These schedules often took into account the moon phases, seasonal weather, and even the couple's blood types. If a queen failed to follow the schedule precisely, she could be accused of sabotaging the royal line. Nothing says romance like a scroll-based ovulation calendar managed by someone who wears a wig powdered with chalk. In some courts, the concept of heir and a spare ruled the day. You needed at least 2 male children to feel secure, one to inherit, and one as backup in case the first fell off a horse, died of smallpox, or was murdered in a political coup. This meant constant pressure to keep producing. A queen who delivered multiple boys gained power and reverence. One who delivered daughters, or worse, failed to carry to term, became a political liability. But the worst part? Miscarriages and stillbirths weren't private sorrows, they were public failures. And the emotional weight of that was crushing. Queen Anne of England, for example, endured 17 pregnancies, with not one child surviving to adulthood. The pain was immense, and yet she was still expected to rule, to smile, and to host balls for other people's children. Her losses weren't seen as tragedies, they were seen as disappointments for the crown. There's an eerie little fringe detail from Tudor England. It was believed that having too much sex after a pregnancy could damage the Queen's chances of producing another healthy child. So some royal husbands were advised to refrain or even, get this, abstain from intimacy with their own wives once an heir was born. Of course, this just meant they took their passions elsewhere, often to the nearest maid or lady-in-waiting. leaving the queen not only exhausted and grieving but also isolated. And yet the palace machine ground on. A queen's fertility could make or break alliances. A male heir could seal a peace treaty. A childless marriage might plunge a kingdom into succession crisis, civil war, or invasion. That kind of pressure sat heavily on every bedchamber, every breakfast conversation, every missed period. You didn't just wake up and wonder about morning sickness. You woke up wondering if your belly was about to start or end a war. Historians continue to debate how much personal affection could survive this atmosphere. Were there genuine love stories buried under all that pressure? Probably. Did some royal couples defy the odds and fall for each other despite the duty? Absolutely. But for many, sex in the palace became a tool, a test, a task to be performed on schedule, under supervision, with the hopes of an entire nation waiting on the outcome. So tonight, as you lie beneath the silken sheets and feel the familiar weight of expectation pressing in from all sides, you wonder, not for the first time, if this is love or just dynastic maintenance. Your husband reaches for your hand. It's warm, it's gentle, and it's almost enough to forget that tomorrow a midwife will be checking your pulse to see if your womb's been activated like a royal treaty. You'd think, after all the pressure, ritual, and very public scrutiny, the royal bedroom would at least be safe from politics. A sanctuary, maybe, a place where lovers could whisper without consequence. But no, because the moment you step through those carved double doors, you're not just entering a bedchamber, you're stepping into a political arena, one with velvet walls and deadly quiet betrayals. Here the sheets are soft, but the motives are sharp. Welcome to the tangled mess of royal bedroom intrigue, where sex is leverage and desire is a dangerous game. Palace walls had ears, sure, but they also had mouths, and they talked. Servants, advisors, lovers, rivals, all watching, listening, waiting for a slip-up. A misplaced touch, a late-night visit, a prolonged absence from the Queen's chamber. These weren't personal moments. They were data points, evidence, fuel for court factions that rose and fell based on who was warming which side of the royal mattress. Sometimes bedroom access itself was the battleground. For kings and queens, intimacy wasn't just about want, it was about who was allowed near and when. In Versailles, only certain noble families could assist the king in dressing and undressing, a ritual that ironically gave them the perfect excuse to linger around his most private moments. The closer you were to the king's skin, the closer you were to power. Even being allowed to hand him his nightshirt or adjust his pillow was a sign of political favour. And if you were too close, well, now you're a liability, a threat. Especially if your affections lean towards someone you shouldn't be touching. Secret affairs between nobles could derail marriages, upend alliances, even spark military conflicts. One of the more famous cases? The affair between Queen Caroline Matilda of Denmark and the royal physician Johann Struensee in the 1770s. Their illicit romance didn't just raise eyebrows, it led to a full-blown scandal that resulted in Struensee's execution and the Queen's exile, all because they crossed a line no bed curtain could hide. These weren't isolated incidents. In many royal courts, the people you slept with, or were rumoured to sleep with, shaped your career. Get caught in the wrong bed, and you could lose your title. Get caught in the right one, and you might gain a province. Lovers weren't just lovers, they were agents of influence, conduits for bribes, and sometimes spies in silk stockings. It gets even better. In some places, the physical layout of the palace was designed to make or break relationships. At the court of the Medici in Florence, secret corridors connected private bedrooms with council chambers, allowing for discreet visits from lovers or informants. In Russia, Catherine the Great had a suite of apartments linked by hidden passages, so she could receive her lovers privately, sure, but also so she could monitor her ministers. The same room where someone whispered sweet nothings might be the same one where a conspiracy was hatched. And you never really knew who you could trust. Ladies in waiting reported to their queens, but some also answered to other factions. Pages and chambermaids were regularly bribed for information about who entered whose room and how long they stayed. Even bodyguards had ears, and loyalty that could be bought. So that midnight kiss you thought was safe, it could end up in a letter to a rival duchess by morning. One curious rarely mentioned detail. Some courts employed what were essentially bedroom scribes, individuals tasked with keeping notes, unofficially, of course, on the private behaviour of royals. This was especially common during periods of succession anxiety, when monarchs needed to prove or deny sexual activity. These scribes didn't sit in the corner with a quill during the act itself, but they collected stories, timings, observations and rumours. Their records were quietly passed along to ministers or even foreign powers. Your libido could literally become part of a state dossier. The most tragic casualties of bedroom intrigue? The children. If a queen gave birth while rumours swirled about her loyalty, the child's legitimacy might be questioned. If a mistress bore a son with suspiciously royal features, courtiers might push for his recognition, or his disappearance. The line between heir and bastard wasn't just biological, it was political, and often it came down to who could control the narrative. One of the most infamous debates in this vein is still unresolved, the so-called Affair of the Diamond Necklace, which indirectly implicated Marie Antoinette in a scandal that wasn't even her fault. A forged letter, a stolen necklace, and a woman posing as the Queen, meeting a cardinal in the gardens for what he thought was a romantic tryst. The scandal became proof to the public that Marie Antoinette was promiscuous and decadent, even though she had no actual involvement. That's the danger of palace bedroom intrigue. Reputation can be weaponised whether or not there's any truth behind the rumours. Some historians believe that entire wars were delayed or accelerated because of bedroom politics. If a king was particularly enchanted with a certain lover, he might side with that lover's homeland. If he fell out with a mistress tied to a foreign court, diplomatic relations could sour overnight. There are whispers that Louis XV delayed certain military actions to please Madame de Pompadour, and Catherine de' Medici is said to have manipulated France's civil wars through subtle manipulations of her sons' love lives. Fringe fact of the night? There are rumours, likely exaggerated but fun, that Venetian ambassadors kept a coded journal of every known affair at the French court, tracking who slept with whom like a geopolitical sex map. It was a form of espionage dressed up as gossip. Think Game of Thrones, but everyone's wearing wigs and powdered lace. And yet, in all this scheming, it was easy to forget the emotional wreckage left behind. Genuine love affairs were often crushed under political pressure. Forbidden romances ended in exile or execution, and even the most powerful monarchs weren't immune to heartbreak. A queen might weep into her pillow after her husband's betrayal. A mistress might age out of favour and find herself alone in a cold, distant manor, her name slowly erased from the records. So tonight, lying in your ornate bed, you don't just worry about passion, you worry about perception, about secrets leaking through silk sheets, about footsteps in the hallway that signal either a lover or a traitor. Your chamber isn't a sanctuary, it's a chessboard, and whether you realise it or not, someone's already made the next move. Eventually, amid all the politics and performance, you realise something's missing, something almost everyone wants, but few in the palace ever get to enjoy: genuine attraction, that flutter in your chest, the heat behind a glance, the kind of pull that can't be orchestrated by diplomats or arranged through strategic bloodlines. Because as much as royal sex was about heirs and alliances, it was also occasionally gloriously unpredictably about seduction. Real, messy, heart-thudding, body-tingling desire. And when that happened behind palace walls, it wasn't always subtle. Seduction in a royal court was never straightforward. You couldn't just say, "Hey, nice doublet, want to go for a walk?" No, you had to play the game. There were rules, layers, rituals, and often a whole orchestra's worth of flirtation techniques finely tuned to each court's sensibilities. The Spanish preferred wordplay. The French, well, they perfected it. The Italians added poetry, music, and secret hand gestures. The English, they awkwardly tried to look charming while pretending they weren't looking at all. So let's say you're interested in someone, maybe a noblewoman or a musician, or, if you're feeling bold, someone of much higher rank. You start with glances, obviously, nothing overt, just lingering eye contact during a dance, a touch of the hand while passing a wine goblet, a few shared smiles in the corridor. But everything you do is being watched, so it's all about plausible deniability. Did she brush your sleeve on purpose, or was it the crowd? Did he compliment your gown, or was it just polite? Every move is a question wrapped in velvet and stitched with risk. And then there's poetry. Letters, verses, cryptic stanzas folded into fans or slipped beneath chamber doors. In the French court, it became almost a language of its own. The king might write a sonnet and send it via a servant who pretends to be delivering candied plums. A lady might respond with a pressed flower, its scent saying more than any written reply. In Catherine de' Medici's court, lovers spoke through colour-coded clothing. Wearing a certain shade of blue might mean I'm thinking of you. Crimson could mean tonight, or in some circles, run. Perfume was a seduction tactic all on its own. In Versailles, entire industries were devoted to concocting signature scents for the elite. A musk laced with vanilla and amber might tell a man you're warm, passionate, and just a touch scandalous. A light citrus might suggest innocence and flirtation. Lovers would swap perfumes, letting their scent linger on one another's skin like a promise. And because everything in the palace was so heavily scented, candles, pillows, wigs, fans, these olfactory messages were both powerful and intimate. One breath could undo a week of restraint. Furniture played a role too, strangely enough. Certain chairs were designed for intimate conversations, low-backed, close-set, with curving arms that let knees almost touch. Secret alcoves and curtained corners became whispering posts, little nooks tucked behind tapestries or just beyond the glow of the chandelier. Some palaces even had designated conversation rooms, not for official business, but for unofficial everything else. They smelled of wax, sweat and anticipation. Of course there were times when seduction jumped straight over subtlety and dove into extravagant gesture. Louis XV once gifted a mistress an entire porcelain palace. Henry VIII wrote passionate, frankly unhinged letters to Anne Boleyn, full of swooning declarations and sudden switches into obsession. The Habsburgs, ever dramatic, favoured symbolic jewellery. Lockets with locks of hair, ruby rings set in the shape of hearts. Some royal lovers commissioned portraits of each other that they kept in private drawers, sometimes nude, often romanticised, always risky. There's a lesser-known but very real quirk from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Nobles would sometimes commission music boxes that played custom tunes, associated with secret affairs. One man reportedly gifted a box that played the first 5 notes of a shared church hymn, the one he and his lover had both sung during their first illicit glance. Sappy, sure, but undeniably effective. And don't forget the physicality of court dances. These weren't just social events, they were playgrounds of chemistry. Every twist and turn, every partnered whirl and brush of fingertips was a chance to test the waters. There was etiquette, of course. Don't linger too long, don't step too close. But everyone broke the rules just enough to say, I'm here, I see you, do you see me back? Still, even with all these tools of seduction, courtly love remained a minefield. If you aimed too high and failed, you could be banished. If you seduced the wrong person's spouse, you might wake up to find your inheritance revoked or your bedroom door nailed shut. Even just being accused of inappropriate behaviour could unravel your life. So each flirty glance, each scented glove, each cryptic line of poetry carried high stakes. This wasn't high school, it was high court, and yet when it worked, it worked. There are stories of couples who navigated all the rules and restrictions to find real fiery connection. Some letters survive, written in spidery ink, pressed between brittle pages, proving that even under velvet gowns and powdered wigs, people felt the same raw longing we do now. They just had to express it more, creatively. Historians love to debate the effectiveness of these seduction rituals. Were they truly about connection, or were they just elaborate rituals meant to stave off boredom and loneliness in gilded cages? Did people fall in love, or did they just fall into habit? Maybe both, maybe neither. But the art of seduction in royal palaces was real, and it left behind a trail of perfumes, poetry, and whispered promises no one could ever fully erase. So tonight, as you lean against the bed's carved headboard, still tasting wine on your lips and the flicker of candlelight in your eyes, you think of that glance someone gave you at dinner, the one that lasted just a breath too long. You're not sure what it meant, but tomorrow maybe there'll be a flower on your chair, or a note tucked beneath your mirror, or maybe, just maybe, that same glance, longer this time, braver. Eventually the whispers and glances and perfumed notes begin to take on a sharper edge. What was once a harmless flirtation turns secretive, dangerous, maybe exhilarating, because in the royal world, where rules are rigid and appearances matter more than truth, nothing gets the heart pounding like doing something or someone you absolutely shouldn't. Welcome to the secret wing of the palace, the one behind the hidden door down the servant stairs, where forbidden desire waits like a loaded trap. Let's be clear, extramarital affairs weren't exactly rare in royal courts. They were practically expected, but that doesn't mean they were safe. Far from it. A discreet liaison with a minor noble might pass with a wink and a shrug, but sleep with the wrong person, say your husband's brother, your wife's maid, or a foreign ambassador, and you could bring the entire house down. And yet, the more dangerous the affair, the more thrilling it became. So how did royals pull it off? Well, if you were clever, rich and brave, or just in deep denial about the consequences, you started with architecture. Most palaces were riddled with hidden passages, servant corridors, and concealed staircases, originally designed for safety or privacy, but conveniently perfect for midnight rendezvous. Some kings had entire secondary suites just a hallway away from their official chambers, where mistresses could be brought unseen. In Versailles, there's a well-documented network of private back doors that allowed mistresses and lovers to come and go while the public rooms remained quiet and undisturbed. Then there were secret signals, a knock pattern, a candle placed in the window, a coloured ribbon worn on the wrist. It sounds like something out of a romance novel, but these little signs were essential in a world where privacy didn't exist. One wrong move, one missed signal, and a tender moment turned into a court scandal with permanent consequences. And let's talk about the risks, because they were staggering. If you were caught, the fallout could be cruel and immediate. For commoners who caught the eye of a royal, things could go either way, elevation or destruction. Take the story of Jane Shore, mistress to Edward IV of England. She was adored by the king, but after his death she was publicly humiliated and forced to walk through the streets of London in penance. All her beauty and charm meant nothing without the protection of a royal hand. For nobles, the stakes were even higher. An affair could result in exile, annulment, or imprisonment. In some cases, it led to death. The tragic tale of Anne Boleyn looms large here, not just because of her infamous end, but because she represents what happens when personal desire collides with political paranoia. Was she guilty of the affairs she was accused of? Historians still argue, but in the eyes of the court, even the appearance of infidelity could be fatal, and queens weren't exempt. If anything, their affairs were more dangerous. If a queen had a child whose parentage could be questioned, it threatened the entire line of succession. That's why queens were guarded closely, their chambers protected, their staff vetted and re-vetted. But despite the surveillance, some queens did have lovers, and some got away with it, or at least managed to keep the truth buried deep enough to survive. One tantalising example, Queen Christina of Sweden. Known for her eccentricity and refusal to marry, she abdicated her throne at 28, dressed as a man, and lived the rest of her life in Rome. Rumours of same-sex affairs followed her everywhere. She kept a close circle of beautiful, fiercely loyal female companions, and wrote letters so emotionally intense they still raise eyebrows. Was it friendship? Was it love? Was it a political distraction? We'll never know for sure, but the scent of secrecy still clings to every parchment. There's another lesser-known but fascinating case in 16th century Italy, Isabella de' Medici. Fiercely intelligent and charming, she allegedly had a long-running affair with a nobleman named Troilo Orsini. When her husband discovered the truth, Isabella was found dead, strangled in her bedchamber. The official story claimed illness. No one believed it. Forbidden desire didn't just risk reputation, it could cost you your life. Of course, not every secret affair ended in tragedy. Some were long-lasting, passionate, even loving. The affair between Augustus the Strong of Saxony and his mistress Anna Constantia was fiery and for a time incredibly influential. She held sway over court appointments, policies, and diplomatic relations. But when she fell out of favour, exile, solitude, letters that went unanswered. Because no matter how hot the passion, it only lasted as long as the favour did. And sometimes the danger wasn't political, it was physical. Lovers who met in secret often relied on servants to sneak them through corridors or deliver messages. But servants could be bribed. Some were blackmailed into betraying their employers. Others turned spy just for the thrill of it. So you might be lying in bed, tangled with someone you've risked everything to be with, and still wonder if the candle flickering outside the door means someone's watching, or worse, coming to end it. Despite all this, the palace pulsed with hidden romances. Human desire, after all, doesn't vanish in the face of danger. It adapts. And when it did, it created secret languages, secret meeting places, and secret heartbreaks. People wrote love letters in invisible ink. They tucked coded notes into sleeves. They buried gifts under floorboards and swore their loyalty under painted ceilings no one else ever looked up at. Historians love digging into these hidden affairs, but many details are lost to time. Some lovers were clever enough to leave no trace. Others left behind only whispers. A poem found in a drawer, a locket with no name, a pressed flower that survived 2 centuries, still fragrant enough to make you wonder what kind of love could stay hidden that long. So tonight, as you lie in your too-big bed, hearing the creak of footsteps in the hall, you wonder, is someone sneaking away from their own bedchamber to meet a forbidden lover? Is there a kiss happening in the dark while the rest of the court sleeps? Or maybe, just maybe, someone is right now tucking a secret letter beneath your pillow, one that says in only a few carefully chosen words, "Meet me when the candles burn low." By now, you might be wondering how any of this, love letters, moonlit trysts, political marriage arrangements wrapped in silk and pressure, could actually lead to babies. You've heard about all the pressure to produce heirs, all the strategic coupling, but what you haven't heard yet is just how weird and wildly wrong most royal-era beliefs about fertility were. Because in those palace bedchambers, where expectation met ignorance, royal sex was shaped not just by politics, but by bad science, superstition, and some truly bizarre medical advice. Let's start with what royals, and their physicians, thought they knew. The human body, according to centuries of popular medical theory, was governed by humours, a delicate balance of heat, moisture, blood, phlegm, bile, and, apparently, nonsense. If a woman's womb was too cold, she couldn't conceive. If a man was overheated, his seed would be weak. Diagnosis often came down to how flushed you looked or what your sweat smelled like. Yes, really. So when conception didn't happen right away, which it often didn't, especially given how little anyone knew about timing or anatomy, the palace started churning out fixes. Aphrodisiacs, tonics, diets, prayers. You might be handed a mixture of honey, cinnamon, and powdered oyster shells, and told to drink it warm while facing east. In England, women were sometimes instructed to rub crushed beetles on their thighs. In France, powdered unicorn horn was believed to increase virility. Too bad unicorns weren't real. And let's not even get started on positioning. Medieval and early modern texts were full of instructions about how to optimize baby making. Women were advised to lie with their hips raised. Men were told to thrust deeply to warm the womb. Some guides insisted that the best position for conception was missionary, because it aligned with God's design, while others went full ancient Greek and said the stars needed to be in the right alignment or the baby would be cursed. Speaking of curses, royal courts were obsessed with magical interference. If a queen failed to conceive, it wasn't just blamed on biology, it might be blamed on a spell. Enemies of the crown, jealous nobles, or even jilted lovers were suspected of hiring witches to curse the royal bed. In 17th century France, the infamous affair of the poisons implicated dozens of nobles, including royal mistresses, in a sprawling scandal involving love potions, hexes, and black masses, all intended to influence the passions of powerful men. One alleged love potion involved powdered toad bones mixed with wine and administered secretly during moments of heightened emotion. Subtle. Of course, none of this addressed the real problems: infertility, genetic issues, untreated diseases, or even simple bad luck. But without modern medicine, royals had no choice but to put their trust in the only people who claimed to understand the mysterious workings of the womb: court physicians. These men, always men, would examine the royal couple and offer diagnoses with the confidence of a magician and the knowledge base of a man who's never seen a uterus. Take, for example, the case of Charles II of Spain. Born of intense inbreeding, he was weak, sterile, and likely infertile from birth. But that didn't stop his court doctors from prescribing him bizarre fertility remedies, including powdered antlers and frequent exposure to sunlight. One even suggested that Charles should sleep with a different woman every night to stimulate the royal seed. No surprise, it didn't work. Then there was poor Louis XVI of France, husband to Marie Antoinette. For years their marriage went unconsummated. Rumours swirled, pamphlets were printed. The couple was ridiculed in salacious caricatures across Europe. The truth? It may have been as simple as a physical condition. Louis may have had phimosis, a painful condition that prevented full intimacy. Eventually surgery, or at least awareness of the issue, helped, and the couple did produce children, but not before they became the most whispered about couple in Versailles. And if things did work out, if a queen became pregnant, Well, then came a whole new list of weirdness. Midwives were called, so were astrologers. People examined the stars to predict the baby's sex, measured the queen's belly for signs of twins, and even used urine tests, literally mixing urine with wine or herbs to determine pregnancy. Yes, that was a thing. Sometimes they'd pluck a strand of the queen's hair and burn it over a candle to see if it curled or straightened. If it curled, the baby was a boy. If it smoked, bad omen. There's a particularly fringe and delightful tidbit from the Polish court. If a queen craved pickled herring during pregnancy, it was believed the baby would be wise and cunning. If she craved sweets, it meant the child would be vain. And if she didn't crave anything at all, the child might be a changeling, a fairy's child swapped in the womb. You can imagine how that played out in an already paranoid court. And let's not forget the ever-present threat of miscarriage, stillbirth or infant mortality. With no prenatal care as we know it and minimal understanding of maternal health, pregnancies were terrifying. Queens often entered seclusion in their last months. Some weren't even allowed to walk unassisted for fear of displacing the baby. Miscarriages were cloaked in shame, seen not as medical events but moral failures. She must have angered God, they'd whisper, or allowed her mind to wander too far from duty. Historians debate how deeply monarchs believed all this, and how much was pageantry, rituals performed because they were expected, not trusted. But evidence suggests that many royal couples, desperate to conceive, genuinely turned to the strangest remedies they could find. When medicine fails, people don't stop hoping, they just reach further into the shadows. So tonight, as the fire pops in your chamber hearth and you sip your nightly tonic, a mixture of cinnamon, red wine and a dash of powdered opal, you wonder, is this love? Is this here? Is this all just theatre? Or is some part of you still hoping that tomorrow, when the astrologer examines the moon's path and the midwife checks your pulse, she'll smile and whisper that ancient holy word, heir? There's a sudden shift in the air the moment a foreign princess sets foot inside the palace gates. The courtiers bow, the trumpets blare, and everyone smiles just a little too tightly. Because when a new royal consort arrives, plucked from another country, another culture, maybe even another language, she doesn't just bring her name and her dowry. She brings her bedroom customs, her expectations, and her secrets, all of which have the power to disrupt everything the palace thought it knew about intimacy. You've seen it before. A French-born queen arrives in a stiff Spanish court and proceeds to scandalise half the nobility by, brace yourself, smiling at her husband in public. Or an Austrian archduchess marries into an Italian dynasty and horrifies her new family by suggesting that maybe, just maybe, the married couple should actually sleep in the same bed. These cultural collisions were more than just awkward, they were tectonic. Take Marie Antoinette, the poster child of royal disorientation. When she came to France at 14, she arrived with Austrian habits, some charming, some deeply out of sync with the French court's protocols. In Vienna, for example, personal modesty was prized. In Versailles, her wedding night was practically a group activity, with nobles trailing into the bedchamber to bless the sheets, offer unsolicited advice and inspect the mood like they were shopping for curtains. Marie's body, barely past childhood, was now a political object. Her discomfort, not even part of the conversation. But it went both ways. Catherine of Braganza, the Portuguese princess who married Charles II of England, brought tea to the English court, yes, that tea, along with her more reserved Catholic attitudes about courtship and marital duty. She found herself surrounded by Charles's rowdy lovers, bawdy jokes, and a culture of barely concealed sexual chaos. She did her best to adapt, but the private tension was enormous, especially since she couldn't bear a child. That failure, mixed with cultural friction, left her increasingly isolated. When foreign royals married into unfamiliar courts, intimacy became diplomacy. Every kiss, every child, every refusal was interpreted through a fog of assumptions and national pride. Did she turn her cheek because she's shy, or because she's rejecting her husband? Did he refuse her invitation because of personal dislike, or because his country's customs discourage nighttime visits before a full moon? It didn't help that foreign queens and kings often arrived with their own staff, ladies-in-waiting, advisors, even personal physicians, who clung fiercely to the customs of home. This created a sort of bedroom Cold War, where two teams existed within one marriage, the wife's people trying to preserve her dignity and traditions, and the husband's, demanding she assimilate immediately. In some palaces, these tensions spilled into gossip. In others, they erupted into outright hostility. There's a particularly wild story about Anne of Cleves, the German-born bride of Henry VIII. She was chosen for him based on a portrait, but when Henry met her in person, he was famously underwhelmed. He declared her unattractive, called her a Flanders mare, and the marriage was never consummated. Historians still argue about whether this was truly about her appearance, or whether the cultural gap between Anne's more modest, reserved upbringing and Henry's lusty, boisterous expectations simply made intimacy impossible. Either way, the fallout was swift: annulment, humiliation, and exile to a country estate. She survived, sure, but she never stepped into a royal bed again. In some cases, foreign influence changed court norms for good. When Louise Elisabeth of France married into the Spanish Bourbon court, she reportedly introduced French beauty rituals, including scented oils, soft bed linens, and actual heated baths, upgrades that scandalised the rigid, austere Spanish court but eventually became standard. One courtier wrote, with visible horror, that she insisted on combing her hair in private and refused to be undressed by more than 2 maids. The nerve! But not all innovations were so welcome. In the Russian court, foreign-born consorts were often suspected of carrying more than just perfumes and lace. They were believed to bring moral corruption. The wives of Peter the Great were viewed with deep suspicion, especially if they dared to act with confidence or independence. One of his mistresses, Anna Mons, was German and known for hosting private salons full of laughter, music and wine. Her influence was seen as subversive, even dangerous. When she fell out of favour, she was banished and her family publicly shamed. And let's not forget the language barrier. Trying to seduce your new spouse when you don't speak their language? Awkward. Trying to do it with a translator standing 2 feet away? Hilarious. Some couples developed their own strange improvised languages of touch and gesture. Others barely communicated at all. And in more than a few cases, marriages remained unconsummated for months, sometimes years, because no one could figure out how to bridge the gap. There's a lesser-known but strangely touching story about Princess Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, who married King George III of England. She spoke almost no English when she arrived, and he spoke no German. But they developed a surprisingly affectionate relationship, bonded over shared routines, and wrote one another short, phonetically spelled notes in each other's languages. Against the odds, they became close, and by many accounts genuinely affectionate lovers. Still, for most royal couples, these cultural clashes left deep scars. Bedroom habits weren't just about comfort, they were about national identity, about pride. A foreign queen who refused to bow to local customs was seen as arrogant or, worse, ungrateful. A foreign king who introduced new intimacy rituals might be mocked behind fans or whispered about in the halls. Historians debate how much of this was perception versus reality. Did foreign queens truly change the sexual culture of courts? Or were they just convenient scapegoats for all things too bold or too different? Hard to say. But one thing is clear. When love crossed borders in a royal palace, it didn't just change the marriage, it changed the bedroom, the court, and sometimes the entire course of a dynasty. So tonight, as the wind rattles the shutters and your foreign-accented lover lies beside you, familiar yet unfamiliar, you reach out not knowing what response you'll get. A kiss, a nod, a quiet sigh in a language you don't speak. The palace doesn't care, the gossip won't wait. But for just this moment, maybe the space between two people feels a little smaller than the space between nations. There's an unmistakable hush in the palace when the king fails to appear from his chambers in the morning. Not for breakfast, not for the morning audience, not even for the ceremonial blessing of his royal slippers. The silence is heavy, loaded. Servants move a little more cautiously. Courtiers glance toward one another, saying nothing. Because when a monarch, sovereign, divine, virile by definition, can't perform his conjugal duties, it's not just a bedroom issue, it's a national emergency, and it happened more often than most historians like to admit. Royal impotence wasn't just an awkward personal matter, it was a political crisis. In monarchies where the king's authority was tied directly to his ability to produce an heir, any failure to perform in bed was seen as a cosmic flaw, an omen, a weakness, sometimes even a curse. And unlike ordinary people, a monarch couldn't quietly ignore the problem. He had advisors, physicians, confessors. Occasionally, a team of whispering ministers gathered like vultures to resolve the issue. Take Louis XVI again. Poor guy. He spent years under public scrutiny because he and Marie Antoinette couldn't consummate their marriage. Gossip flew through the salons of Paris like wildfire. Was he uninterested, incompetent, sick, gay? Pamphleteers had a field day, some going so far as to publish illustrated guides explaining how the royal couple might go about it. Historians now believe Louis may have suffered from a mild condition that caused pain during intercourse, but it didn't matter. To the court and the public, the delay in producing an heir was a national embarrassment. It was her fault. It was his fault. It was everyone's business but their own. And then there's Henry VIII, whose manhood was practically a kingdom unto itself, until it wasn't. After the failure of several marriages and a string of miscarriages and stillbirths, questions arose. Was the King of England, the self-styled lion of Europe, secretly impotent? Some courtiers whispered that he had trouble completing the act. Others pointed out his increasing weight, his festering leg injury, his unpredictable rages, all signs in their view of a man who could no longer seal the deal. Henry naturally did what any insecure royal might do. He blamed the women. Annulments, beheadings and church reform followed. Because sometimes it's easier to start a new religion than to admit you've got issues below the belt. Of course, not all kings handled it with such carnage. In Spain, Charles II, already known as the Bewitched, due to his severe physical and mental disabilities, was widely believed to be impotent. His 2 marriages produced no children, and his court was obsessed with figuring out why. Court physicians examined him. Religious officials prayed over him. Rumours of witchcraft swirled. One theory proposed that he had been hexed in the womb, cursed never to reproduce. There was even talk that he didn't fully understand what sex involved. The scrutiny was relentless. The irony? By the time anyone admitted the problem couldn't be fixed, the Habsburg line was on its last legs, and Europe was headed toward war over who got the Spanish throne. But impotence wasn't just a royal concern, it also affected noblemen, dukes, and princes whose sexual prowess determined whether or not they could hold power. In France, the king could legally annul a marriage if it wasn't consummated, but only if he had medical witnesses to prove it, which meant that some unfortunate lords were required to undergo humiliating examinations to assess whether they were, as the legal document so delicately put it, able to perform the act of marriage. These weren't subtle affairs. They involved physicians, sometimes clergy, and, brace yourself, public testimonies from wives about their husbands' failures. Yes, people stood in court and described in detail just how disappointing their wedding night had been. Even worse. In rare cases, noblemen were forced to demonstrate their virility in front of witnesses to prove their ability. You'd think this was fiction. It's not. During particularly contentious annulment trials in Renaissance Italy, men were sometimes made to engage in simulated marital activity under the supervision of court-appointed experts. This wasn't entertainment. It was law. A tragic mix of shame, pressure, and invasive bureaucracy. For royal women, impotence was just as damaging, though cloaked in different language. If the husband couldn't perform, the wife was still blamed for failing to inspire him. She might be called cold, barren, or witch-like. Some queens, desperate to avoid disgrace, agreed to quiet annulments or allowed the king to take a mistress while keeping their titles intact. Others fought back. Catherine of Aragon, for instance, fiercely denied Henry VIII's claims that their marriage had never been consummated. Her insistence, made in front of cardinals and nobles, was more than personal, it was political survival. And if the court believed a queen's husband was impotent, rumours of alternative conception began to bubble. Was the child really his? Was a lover involved? Was the lineage even legitimate? Entire lines of succession teetered on the edge of these whispered doubts. One persistent rumour, unproven but juicy, claimed that a Danish prince's heir was actually the product of a carefully arranged affair between the princess and a hand-picked noble with more, shall we say, reliability. True or not, it shows how deeply the issue of virility was tied to dynasty, and how far people would go to preserve an illusion of potency. One of the oddest fringe practices related to impotence came from parts of Eastern Europe, where some nobles swore by magical belts, and charm rings supposedly blessed by holy men to restore masculine power. These were worn at night, and sometimes during intercourse itself. One ring, now housed in a museum, bears the Latin inscription Vires Domini, the strength of the Lord. It's not entirely clear which lord they meant, but the desperation speaks for itself. Historians still argue over how much of these stories were real, and how much were whispered exaggerations used to humiliate or discredit powerful men. After all, accusing someone of impotence wasn't just personal, it was political assassination. To say a king couldn't perform was to say he couldn't rule. So tonight, as the fire dies low in your lavish bedroom, you hear nothing from the adjoining suite. No movement, no creaking of the royal bed, just silence. And in that silence the whispers begin, low, treacherous and deadly. Not because a man couldn't please his wife, but because a king who couldn't perform might be one heartbeat away from losing everything. Eventually, somewhere between the choreographed ceremonies and the whispered humiliations, a curious thing begins to happen. Some women, queens, duchesses, ladies-in-waiting, stop waiting to be chosen. They stop playing the passive, powdered, pedestal-perched role they've been assigned. And in the stillness of the palace, behind layers of taffeta and diplomacy, they reach out. They choose. Because while history loves to crown kings as the architects of desire, it was often royal women who truly took the lead in rewriting the script of sex and power. It wasn't easy, of course. For a queen or noblewoman to show initiative in matters of the flesh was risky. In many courts, even a flirtatious look could brand a woman as indecent, dangerous, or not queenly. But the ones who dared? They shaped dynasties, crushed enemies, and, sometimes, changed the rules of the royal bedroom forever. Start with Catherine the Great. No, not the ridiculous horse rumour, which is nonsense by the way, but the actual woman, Empress of Russia, intellectual reformer, and yes, a woman with a strong sexual appetite and zero patience for being told no. Catherine chose her lovers personally, often grooming them through flirty correspondence or invitations to her court. She didn't care if the man was younger or less noble. She cared if he was clever, loyal, and available. Her lovers weren't just eye candy, they were confidants, sometimes even political allies. And if they lost her interest, she gave them a pension, a title, and a polite exit. Classy. Then there's Marguerite de Valois, the infamous Queen Margot of France, whose lovers numbered more than most of her male contemporaries. She was beautiful, yes, but also dangerously smart. During the wars of religion, she used her relationships with powerful men to broker peace, gather intelligence, and ensure her survival. Her sexual freedom was so legendary that pamphlets painted her as a nymphomaniac. But read between the lines and it's clear, she wasn't scandalous. She was strategic, and she wasn't alone. In England, Bess of Hardwicke, a commoner turned countess, married 4 times, each time gaining more wealth and influence. While not a royal herself, her mastery of marital politics allowed her to build one of the most powerful family dynasties of the Elizabethan era. She understood that intimacy wasn't just about the bedroom, it was about contracts, alliances, and leverage, and she used it repeatedly to her advantage. Even queens who didn't openly take lovers found subtle ways to flip the script. Anne of Austria, queen to Louis XIII of France, was often thought of as pious and passive, but behind closed doors she maintained private friendships and emotional connections that danced right on the edge of propriety. When accused of having an affair with the Duke of Buckingham, she didn't deny it outright. She simply made herself untouchable by surrounding herself with loyal ladies, burying her correspondence in coded language, and reminding everyone that she was both queen and a Spanish princess. If you accused her, you weren't just questioning her virtue, you were risking war. And let's talk about bedroom decor, because even there, royal women exerted power. While kings filled their chambers with maps, antlers, and masculine pomp, many queens curated sensual sanctuaries, spaces with plush textures, floral motifs, soothing colours, and lighting designed to flatter rather than intimidate. These were rooms designed not just for rest or display, but for pleasure. The right pillows, the right perfume, the right music drifting in from a side chamber. It was a subtle form of control, and it worked. One fringe but fascinating fact. In 18th century Italy, certain noblewomen commissioned custom conversation sofa, low, crescent-shaped divans designed specifically for flirtation. They were engineered so 2 people could sit close without technically touching. Add in a sheer curtain, some ambient harp music, and a chilled glass of fortified wine, and suddenly the Duchess was no longer a background player in the palace. She was the one deciding who stayed for the evening. Even in the Ottoman Empire, where the harem system seems, from the outside, like a tool of patriarchal dominance, women in the imperial harem wielded immense behind-the-scenes power. Valida sultans, mothers of the reigning sultan, were often the most influential people in the entire empire, and concubines, far from being passive ornaments, learned to play the court game with ruthless efficiency. They could form factions, influence appointments, and in some cases, rise to positions of near equal political authority. Their access to the ruler wasn't just sexual, it was strategic, and they used it. Historians are slowly reclaiming these women's stories, peeling back the male-centred myths to reveal a far more nuanced reality. Yes, the dangers were real. Accusations of adultery could still destroy a woman in an instant, but the record shows that many royal women were not afraid to redefine the rules. They pursued their desires carefully, sometimes boldly, often brilliantly. And when they succeeded, they didn't just satisfy their hearts or bodies, they bent the will of empires. There's still debate, of course. Did women like Catherine and Marguerite truly enjoy sexual freedom? Or were they still playing a rigged game with prettier cards? Were their relationships acts of rebellion or survival? Maybe both. Maybe it depends on the night, the partner, and the particular mood in the room. But one thing is certain. These women didn't just receive affection, they directed it. They wrote letters laced with clever wordplay. They selected their perfumes to leave trails on purpose. They hosted private salons where conversations hovered just above scandal. They knew the value of a glance, the weight of a whisper. And most importantly, they weren't waiting to be invited into the bedroom. They were unlocking the door themselves. So tonight, as you lie beneath that embroidered canopy and consider the silence beside you, whether from absence or indifference, you turn on your side and face the candlelight. Maybe tomorrow you'll choose. Not just how you love, but who. Maybe the Queen isn't waiting anymore. Maybe, just maybe, she's done playing nice. The palace is quiet again, but not with sleep. It's that charged, unnatural stillness, the kind that happens when everyone is pretending not to see what they've already noticed. Eyes glance away too quickly. Conversations shift just a beat too fast. Because while royal love affairs were scandal enough, what really made the walls shudder were the ones that couldn't be named. The glances not just across ranks or political lines, but across gender lines. Tonight, we step into the shadowy realm of same-sex desire in royal palaces, where the risks were enormous, the rewards fleeting, and the truth still tangled in centuries of secrets. This isn't a modern invention. Same-sex relationships, emotional, romantic, sexual, have existed in every era, including inside the world's most opulent palaces. But in a setting built on appearances, marriage alliances, and producing heirs, these desires had to be cloaked so carefully they often vanished entirely from the official record. That doesn't mean they didn't happen. It just means that when they did, they slipped between the lines, hidden in poetry, letters, coded language, and sometimes exquisitely scandalous rumours. Start with King James I of England. His relationship with George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham, has been debated for centuries. What we do know, the king wrote him passionate letters referring to Villiers as his sweet child and wife, my only joy, and even my darling. He gave him titles, lands, influence, more than any other court favourite. James was married with children, but the language he used with Villiers wasn't political. It was intimate. Whether or not they were lovers in a physical sense is still debated, but emotional intimacy? Undeniable. The court noticed. So did foreign ambassadors, who wrote about the closeness with thinly veiled disdain or envy. Then there's Queen Christina of Sweden, already mentioned for her refusal to conform to gender norms. Christina wore men's clothing, refused to marry, and surrounded herself with beautiful, educated women. Her most famous companion, Ebba Sparre, was described by Christina as her bedfellow and beloved. Christina's letters to Ebba are loaded with longing, praise, and romantic metaphors. Live only for me, she wrote. Remember me always, and never forget the one who loves you more than life. It's impossible to read those words and not feel the pulse of real, if forbidden, affection. Of course, same-sex love wasn't always couched in high poetry. In many courts, especially among young men, intimate relationships between pages, squires, or artists were an open secret, tolerated as long as they stayed discreet and didn't interfere with dynastic plans. In Renaissance Italy, male friendship could involve kissing, sharing beds, and long emotional letters. Some of these bonds were likely platonic, others clearly weren't. One Medici prince was rumoured to have maintained a substantial companionship with his fencing master for over a decade, until the man was abruptly transferred to Florence, and the prince fell into a sullen, mysterious depression that lasted weeks. And the women? They had their own networks. In Versailles, the ladies-in-waiting lived in close quarters, often sleeping two to a bed, sharing stories, perfume and secrets. Some of these bonds blossomed into deeper connections, quiet love stories tucked inside embroidered pillowcases and traded in soft whispers behind closed doors. Letters survive between certain women that read like diary entries, aching, confessional, sometimes wildly suggestive. "When I am not near you, I sleep with your ribbon tied around my wrist," wrote one duchess to her friend. "It is the only way I rest." But make no mistake, these relationships were risky. In a world where marriage was a political contract and sex had to produce heirs, anything that deviated from the norm was treated as either foolish, dangerous, or criminal. In Tudor England, sodomy was a capital offence. Being caught in a same-sex act could lead to execution, or if you were lucky, exile and disgrace. So those glances, those letters, those trembling fingers brushing in the candlelight, they carried not just the weight of desire, but fear. And still people loved. They found ways. Coded language was everywhere. In letters, friend meant something more. Affection meant passion. Comfort often meant physical closeness. In some European courts, couples gave each other mirrored lockets or used symbolic flowers to send messages. The violet meant devotion. The hyacinth, longing. The bluebell, a secret shared. It's easy to imagine a royal lover wearing such a token close to their heart, hidden beneath layers of court attire, invisible to everyone but the one person who mattered. Fringe fact of the night. In 18th century Prussia, Frederick the Great, long speculated to have had romantic relationships with men, once had a marble statue commissioned of Antinous, the famed companion of Roman Emperor Hadrian. The statue was placed in his private garden, away from prying eyes, where he reportedly liked to sit alone in the evenings, a silent tribute to a love that had no place in his court but lived on in stone. It's hard to know how many of these stories are true in the way we want them to be. Historians argue over how much was love, how much was deep friendship, how much was just court gossip passed around like spiced wine. But when you read the letters, really read them, it's hard not to feel the undercurrent. That ache, that longing, that defiance. And sometimes these relationships weren't just tolerated, they were protected. A powerful monarch might quietly ignore a favoured courtier's relationship as long as it didn't make waves. A queen might know her lady-in-waiting was more emotionally invested than appropriate and turn the other cheek. There was an unspoken rule in many courts. Don't ask, don't confirm, don't threaten the bloodline. Tonight, in your own quiet chamber, you might wonder how many nights were spent like this in centuries past. Two hearts, separated by fear and duty, whispering in the dark, knowing that by morning they must become once again only friends. How many kings fell asleep clutching a letter they couldn't show anyone? How many queens turned their faces to the wall, dreaming of someone who wasn't in their bed? The palace doesn't remember those stories in its grand portraits or its golden tapestries, but the walls remember. And the beds, those creaky, candle-lit beds, probably still hold echoes of every forbidden sigh. The candle flickers beside your bed, and from somewhere in the corridors of the palace a bell tolls midnight. Another day, another ceremony, another round of silk robes and whispered glances. But you, lying in this grand room stuffed with velvet and expectation, feel the ache of something heavier. Not lust, not love, not even ambition, but guilt. Because even in palaces where every pleasure is carved into marble, there's always one set of eyes watching that no servant, lover, or courtier can avoid. Gods. And for many kings and queens, the pull of desire was never fully separate from the cold, sharp edge of religious guilt. In some courts, especially Catholic ones, the line between passion and sin was a razor's width. Sex was allowed, required even, but only under the right conditions, within marriage, for procreation, and preferably without too much enjoyment. If you were too eager, too experimental, or too frequent, it could be seen as lustful, and lust, of course, was a deadly sin, even for royals, maybe especially for royals. So what did that mean for intimacy, Pierre? Imagine finishing a long, exhausting, politically mandated bedroom act, one that might have been tender or tense or awkward, and then having to confess it the next morning, literally. In Catholic monarchies, it was common for rulers to attend regular confession, and many were encouraged, strongly, to confess even the most mundane acts of marital sex. Why? Because if there was even a hint of pleasure for pleasure's sake, it might be seen as impure. Kings, queens, and high-ranking nobles had personal confessors, usually powerful, educated men appointed by the church, who acted as both spiritual advisors and moral monitors. These confessors weren't just there to absolve sin. They had influence over everything from bedroom behaviour to royal policy. A particularly strict confessor could convince a king to abstain from sex for months. Some queens were advised to avoid sex during Lent, Advent, or on feast days, reducing their opportunity to conceive, but, in the Church's eyes, preserving their souls. There's a recorded case of Philip II of Spain, who, according to his letters and his confessors, constantly struggled with guilt over physical desire. Despite being deeply devout and married, he worried that his longing for his wife, yes, his wife, was sinful. His confessor advised him to moderate the marital act and focus his thoughts on divine service during intercourse. If you've ever tried to feel sexy while thinking about eternal judgment, you can imagine how well that worked out. But Catholic monarchies weren't the only ones with bedroom guilt. In Protestant courts, especially in Calvinist or Puritan-influenced regions, sex was allowed but had to remain sober, orderly, and clearly tied to duty. Fun? Suspicious? Kinky? Absolutely not. There's a story from a Scottish court where a noble couple was reprimanded for engaging in intercourse on the Sabbath, even though they were married and trying to conceive. The act itself wasn't the problem, the timing was. This tension between spiritual purity and physical desire led to some truly bizarre behaviour. Some monarchs scheduled sex around religious holidays, choosing safe windows when the church calendar wouldn't frown too harshly. Others fasted or prayed before intimacy, asking forgiveness in advance. A few even kept journals, private spiritual diaries, tracking their temptations and their failures. Louis IX of France is said to have wept in prayer after marital sex, fearing that his enjoyment had insulted God. Then there were those who took the opposite approach, indulgence followed by confession in an endless cycle. They would sin lavishly, then confess grandly, as if absolution could be purchased like perfume or pearls. This approach was especially popular in the Baroque courts of Italy and France, where sensuality dripped from every fresco and curtain, and yet the spectre of hellfire still hovered behind every candelabra. Some confessors took things further. If a queen confessed to enjoying sex too much, she might be prescribed a period of abstinence. If a king admitted to sleeping with a mistress, his penance could be fasting, donating to a monastery, or even public acts of piety, and if he refused, the church could withhold sacraments. No communion, no last rites. In a deeply religious world, this was terrifying. Fringe fact, in the Spanish court under the Habsburgs, there were documented cases where midwives and priests collaborated to create chastity schedules, literally, calendars that marked out when sex was spiritually permissible. These were hung in some royal chambers, sometimes under a veil or in a desk drawer, but always close at hand. Marital sex on the wrong day could require confession. Extramarital sex? That could damn your soul. All of this created a strange kind of bedroom tension, not just between lovers, but between body and soul. One part of you longed to touch, to be close, to forget the crown for a few moments. The other part whispered warnings about sin, punishment, and shame. It wasn't just your conscience you had to worry about. It was the entire religious hierarchy listening, judging, and sometimes dictating what happened between your sheets. Some monarchs rebelled. They rejected the guilt and gave in to pleasure, refusing to confess or even challenging the church's authority. Henry VIII's split from Rome wasn't just about divorce. It was also about control. He didn't want to ask permission for what he did in his bedroom. Others found ways to balance both worlds. Catherine de' Medici, for instance, maintained an image of piety while overseeing a court famous for its sensuality and scandal. She gave lavish gifts to churches and funded convents while simultaneously hosting ballets that left little to the imagination. Historians still debate how deeply this guilt was felt. Were kings truly tormented by their passions, or did they perform piety because it was expected? Did queens really agonize over every kiss, or did they learn to separate the spiritual from the physical? We may never know, but in their letters, their confessions, and their sudden silences, there's evidence of struggle, not just with love or duty, but with themselves. So tonight, as you lie beneath your canopy, the heavy cross on the wall glinting faintly in the candlelight, you wonder if it's watching. You wonder if pleasure and sin are really twins, or if someone just told you they were. Your partner stirs beside you unaware. You reach out slowly, not because you're defying God, but because just for tonight, you want to feel human. Eventually, no matter how tightly you draw the bed curtains, the outside world crashes in. Rumours become headlines. Affection turns to ammunition. And what was once just a tryst or a whispered passion becomes a full-blown political catastrophe. Because in a royal court, scandal doesn't just ruin reputations, it can topple entire thrones. And few scandals have the destructive, dazzling power of a royal sex affair gone very, very public. It usually starts small. A glance held too long, a late-night visit noticed by the wrong servant. A letter intercepted and passed through trembling hands until it lands on the desk of someone who knows exactly how to use it. And suddenly, what was once a private matter of bodies and feelings becomes state business, discussed by ministers, printed in broadsheets, and carved into public memory. Take, for example, the infamous affair between King Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson. He was a king, she was an American divorcee, and their love affair, electrified by gossip and scandal, led to a constitutional crisis. Edward wanted to marry her, the government refused, the church condemned it. And in the end, he abdicated the throne. One of the most powerful monarchs in Europe gave up his crown for sex, love and scandal. Though of course they never described it that way in polite company. Earlier, centuries before, the French court had its own sex-fueled collapse, with the affair of the diamond necklace, a complex scandal involving Queen Marie Antoinette, a conwoman posing as a confidant, and a very expensive necklace. The Queen had no part in the theft, but rumours that she had orchestrated the deal to satisfy her alleged lover spread like wildfire. The French public, already furious with the monarchy, latched onto the tale. It painted Marie as vain, manipulative and sexually corrupt. And although the revolution had many causes, this scandal helped set the public mood on fire. But even when the stakes weren't national collapse, the damage was often profound. Consider the downfall of George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham, under Charles I of England. Beloved by the king, perhaps too beloved, depending on which historian you ask, Villiers became a lightning rod for scandal. His wealth, influence and rumoured intimacy with the king made him a target. After a failed military campaign, critics called him incompetent, corrupt, and inappropriately close to the crown. He was assassinated in 1628. Some say it was political, others whisper it was personal revenge born from jealousy and betrayal tangled in royal bedsheets. Even private affairs between lesser royals could spiral out of control. Princess Charlotte of Wales, a future queen who died young, had a reputation for resisting the cold, clinical matchmaking of royal life. She fell in love with Prince Leopold, yes, but her early romantic entanglements were scrutinised, criticised and nearly cost her everything. The idea that a princess might pursue her own desires, choose her own husband, or, heaven forbid, express her feelings publicly was considered borderline treasonous. Love wasn't supposed to be her choice, it was supposed to be her duty. The court of Versailles, always the gold standard of decadence, practically invented the modern sex scandal. Madame de Montespan, mistress to Louis XIV, found herself at the heart of the Affaire des Poissons, a tangled web of black masses, alleged baby sacrifices, and love potions. Whether or not she was guilty didn't really matter. Her reputation was destroyed. Louis distanced himself. Her former friends abandoned her. She died quietly in a convent, the echo of her once golden name fading behind stone walls. Scandals like these were more than juicy gossip. They were weapons. Factions within the palace used them to destroy rivals. Ministers whispered them to foreign ambassadors. Writers printed them in pamphlets passed out in marketplaces. One night of passion, real or imagined, could be turned into a political coup if the right person decided to leak the right detail to the wrong hands. Sometimes it wasn't even real. Accusations could be fabricated, especially if a noblewoman was gaining too much power or a favoured advisor needed to be removed. A well-placed rumour about a compromising letter or an unescorted midnight walk could lead to an interrogation, exile, or worse. Queen Caroline of Ansbach was falsely accused of adultery in the early 1700s by political enemies seeking to discredit her husband's reign. The charges didn't stick, but the stain remained, whispered in corners long after her death. And then there's the tragedy of Princess Helene of Orleans, whose engagement to the Prince of Naples was broken off due to religious tensions, but the gossip that followed, that was all about her supposed affair with a married man at court, Nothing was ever proven. The scandal faded. But she never married. Her name became a cautionary tale, not of rebellion or romance, but of the cost of being watched too closely. In some cases, scandal didn't destroy, it elevated. Royal mistresses who were smart enough to manipulate public opinion could use their notoriety as power. Madame du Barry, for instance, turned her role as Louis XV's mistress into a political post, winning favours for friends and building alliances. She was hated, yes, but she lasted, until the revolution came knocking, of course. Fringe fact of the night. In early 18th century Russia, some nobles held scandal diaries, small personal journals where they wrote down every whispered rumour and bit of gossip they heard. These weren't just for entertainment. They were used as blackmail material, quiet bombs to be detonated when political tides shifted. More than one exile or arranged marriage came about thanks to a well-timed page of scandalous scribbles. Modern historians still argue about how much damage these scandals really did. Were they distractions from deeper political rot? Or were they the rot itself, proof that when a royal bed caught fire, the entire court could burn with it? The answer seems to be both. In some cases, an affair stayed a private tragedy. In others, it pulled the threads of a crown until the whole tapestry came apart. So tonight, as you sit in your gilded chamber and notice the way that page glances at you, too long, too sword-curious, you wonder, not what if, but who saw? Because in a palace, the walls don't just talk, they take notes. And sometimes all it takes is one scandal, one night, one name spoken in the wrong ear to rewrite your entire story. If you're already exhausted by the pressure of producing heirs, dodging scandal, deciphering courtly seduction, and hiding forbidden love, I have bad news. We haven't even touched on magic. Yes, magic. Because for many centuries, inside the same palaces that housed philosophers, theologians, and rational men of science, there also lived an unshakable belief that sex, fertility, and desire could be conjured or cursed. Even the most powerful royals weren't immune to superstition. In fact, they were often the most superstitious of all. When medicine failed, when heirs didn't appear, when passion turned cold or scandal threatened to erupt, the royal bedchamber became fertile ground, not just for intimacy, yes, but for enchantment, ritual, and full-on magical interventions. Call it desperation, call it tradition, call it what it was, a strange sensual blend of politics and the occult. Start with love potions. Nearly every European court had its own apothecaries, official ones with real herbs and tinctures, but just beyond them lurked the underground network of potion makers, herbalists and outright witches who specialised in more unconventional remedies. Want your spouse to fall madly in love with you? Drink this wine infused with rosemary powdered emerald and a drop of menstrual blood. Yes, that was a real recipe, and yes, it was widely believed to work. The logic was disturbingly simple. The body held power. Blood, sweat, hair, and other more intimate fluids were considered potent ingredients. They could bind someone to you, inflame desire, or even curse their ability to be with anyone else. In one case, a Venetian noblewoman was accused of feeding her lover mashed figs soaked in her breast milk to keep him faithful. Whether or not it worked is unclear. What is clear is that when she was caught, she was imprisoned for manipulating the will of a Christian man through unholy means. That's court speak for magic via sex. And it wasn't always about attraction. Sometimes spells were cast to prevent passion entirely. Jealous wives, noble or otherwise, might consult a cunning woman to tie their husbands. This infamous practice, known as ligature or knot magic, supposedly rendered a man physically incapable of performing with anyone but his wife. It was considered so dangerous that certain European courts outlawed it specifically. Some husbands, upon experiencing sudden and mysterious impotence, immediately blamed witches rather than diet, age, or guilt. Convenient. The church naturally hated all of this, but it also quietly believed it. Many priests and confessors warned kings and queens about the dangers of magical seduction. Be careful what you consume, they'd whisper. Be careful who touches your bed linens. There were tales of servants placing hexes under mattresses or slipping cursed powders into shoes. One French queen is said to have had her bed exorcised after a series of troubling dreams and a mysterious rash on her inner thighs. The records never confirm what the rash was, but the fear, that was real. Fringe fact, in 17th century Russia, a spell book known as the Treasure of Secrets made its way into the hands of certain courtiers. It included such delightful incantations as how to ensure your husband returns to your bed, and how to make a woman fall for you using bare saliva. No one talks about it in official documents, but scribbled marginalia in noblemen's journals suggest that these things were tried. More than once. There were also charms meant to increase fertility, amulets worn around the waist, talismans tied to the bedpost, carved stones slipped under pillows. In some courts, royal couples were encouraged to sleep with relics, bones of saints, bits of holy fabric, or even dried flowers blessed by mystics. These were meant to inspire conception or purify the union. And if a queen suffered multiple miscarriages, the court might call in a healer, a mystic, or a cunning woman to unblock the womb with prayer, herbs, and occasionally ritual fumigation of the uterus. Not pleasant, not effective, but disturbingly common. It got darker when rivals became involved. A jilted mistress, denied status or dismissed without grace, might seek revenge, not with daggers or letters, but with hexes. One notorious case involved a noblewoman who, after being dismissed from court, allegedly commissioned a doll carved in the image of her former lover. She pricked it with pins, buried it under moonlight. Within weeks, the man fell ill. Coincidence? Probably, but he never returned to the palace, and the whispers never stopped. And sometimes these magical acts became public trials. The affair of the poisons, already mentioned, wasn't just about murder. It involved a tangled web of love spells, black masses, and dark rituals designed to bend royal desire. The accused included nobles, mistresses, and even clerics. They were said to perform masses over the bodies of infants, drink hallucinogenic brews, and chant incantations to make the king fall in love or fall apart. Some confessions were likely extracted under torture, but the panic they caused was very real. Not all magical beliefs were dark, though. In more romantic corners of the world, folk traditions flourished. In parts of Scandinavia, lovers exchanged silver rings blessed under the midsummer moon to ensure fidelity. In Poland, noble brides were given honey cakes dusted with protective herbs to eat before the wedding night, supposedly ensuring a joyful union. In India's Mughal courts, jasmine and sandalwood oils were believed to carry aphrodisiacal properties, and entire chambers were perfumed to invite harmony and passion. Was it science? No, but it was heartfelt. Historians are split on how seriously monarchs took these magical methods. Some argue that much of it was symbolic, rituals performed for comfort, not belief. Others insist that when heirs failed to appear, and when love cooled in royal marriages, many monarchs did what anyone does when reason fails. They turned to hope in stranger forms. So tonight, as you settle under the weight of embroidered sheets and perfumed pillows, something tickles the edge of your thoughts. That sachet tucked beneath your mattress, placed there by your maid, the scent of rosemary lingering in your wine, the warmth of your partner's hand as it moves slowly, uncertainly, across your back. Is it love, chemistry, or something older, wilder, something that predates titles and tapestries? You close your eyes and wonder if someone, somewhere in the palace, is whispering your name over a candle, or if perhaps you're doing the same for them. It's the middle of the night, and you're lying awake again, too much on your mind, too many whispers echoing behind your eyes. Because here's the thing no one talks about at court. It's not just about you and your partner. It's not just about romance or seduction or scandal. It's about everything you've inherited, the expectations, the dysfunction, the ancient mess passed down like a family crest etched in stone. Because in royal palaces, sex isn't just shaped by politics or protocol, it's haunted by the sins of the ancestors. You don't just marry a person in these walls, you marry their bloodline, their family history, their scandals, superstitions, medical baggage, and emotional bruises. And those things, they seep into the bedroom like drafts through the marble floor. Take the Habsburgs, a dynasty so obsessed with keeping their bloodline pure that they intermarried for centuries, cousin with cousin, niece with uncle, sometimes looping the family tree into knots. The result? Charles II of Spain, a man so genetically damaged by generations of inbreeding that he was physically deformed, intellectually stunted, and, by all accounts, incapable of consummating his marriage. His jaws couldn't close properly. His tongue was too large to speak clearly. His own wife reportedly described their wedding night as solemn and without success. The dynasty collapsed not just from poor governance, but because the royal bed had finally reached a point of genetic dead end. And then there's Henry VIII. whose marital disasters weren't just about lust or ego. They were about a deep, almost superstitious obsession with producing a male heir. A fixation so intense that it led to 6 marriages, 2 beheadings, and the complete restructuring of England's religious landscape. But behind that was trauma. A father who seized power through bloodshed. A lineage that barely survived civil war. Henry's bed wasn't just for love, it was the battlefield on which he tried to silence every ghost of instability that haunted his crown. Generational patterns didn't stop at fertility. Look at Louis XIV, the Sun King. His grandfather was assassinated. His father died young. His mother, a devout and distant queen, taught him that pleasure was dangerous, but power was divine. And yet Louis surrounded himself with mistresses, Madame de Montespan, Madame de Maintenon, and fathered at least 16 illegitimate children. It's as if for every wound inherited, he tried to assert life. He filled his court with sex and spectacle, but underneath it you can feel the thread of someone trying desperately to outpace fate. In some families, trauma echoed through emotional coldness. Royal children raised by wet nurses and tutors, trained from the cradle to prioritise diplomacy over affection, grew into adults who couldn't express love without calculation. Letters from 18th century German duchesses reveal a heartbreaking consistency. He is kind, but distant. We speak only of matters of state. He does not touch me unless summoned by duty. These women weren't unloved, they were caught in dynasties where warmth was not part of the curriculum. And for every dysfunctional father-son relationship, there were mother-daughter inheritances just as tangled. Queens who'd been used as pawns in foreign alliances often raised their daughters to be wary, strategic, emotionally armoured. Take Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, who micromanaged the marriages of her 16 children, including Marie Antoinette. She offered detailed advice, sometimes cold, always clinical, about how to behave in bed, how to please a husband, how to secure power through childbearing. She loved her children, but she trained them for a world where affection could be fatal. Sometimes the dysfunction was the medical. Kings carried hereditary diseases, porphyria, haemophilia, syphilis, and passed them on with a single night under the sheets. Queen Victoria was a carrier of haemophilia, a condition that would ripple across Europe's royal families for generations, weakening the Romanovs, crippling Spanish princes, and haunting the House of Habsburg with every newborn male. It wasn't romantic, it wasn't symbolic, it was biology turned legacy, and it left no room for denial. Even in more emotionally stable dynasties, you find patterns. Silent marriages, loveless unions, excessive control, affairs repeated across generations like echoing footsteps still in the palace corridors. One French noblewoman wrote in her diary that her mother, her grandmother, and her great-grandmother had all been married at 15, had all been ignored by their husbands, and had all taken lovers before their 20th birthdays. We are taught to remain composed, she wrote, but our blood has always whispered otherwise. Fringe detail. In certain royal houses, astrologers were hired not just to chart favourable marriage dates, but to study ancestral charts, to warn about the curse of the third son, or the shadow of the first marriage. These weren't metaphors, these were legitimate royal anxieties. The idea that certain beds, certain combinations of bloodlines, carried doom in their very fabric. Modern scholars call this intergenerational trauma, but back then it was just family. And in palaces, family wasn't just something you were born into. It was something you performed, passed on and reproduced. Even if it meant recreating the same wounds over and over again behind lace-draped doors. So tonight, when you roll over and stare at the gilded ceiling above you, you can almost hear them, the ancestors. All those kings and queens who came before lying in this same bed, or one just like it. Whispers in the dark. Unspoken expectations, regrets, and patterns they didn't know how to break. Patterns you've inherited whether you want to or not. Maybe your marriage was arranged. Maybe your heart is elsewhere. Maybe you're just tired of living a life built on someone else's idea of legacy. But as your partner breathes quietly beside you, you ask yourself a quiet question. Not what will I pass on, but what stops with me. Morning comes with a soft knock, and a servant enters bearing rosewater for your face, a folded note on a silver tray, and a careful lack of eye contact. It's all so polished, so practiced, but behind every gesture, every tilt of the tray and every rustle of silk, there's a secret everyone understands but no one says aloud. The real power in the palace doesn't always sit on a throne. Sometimes it walks quietly, listens closely, and changes history without ever speaking above a whisper. Because in the royal world, the people who make the beds often know more about what happens in them than the ones who sleep there. This is the hidden world of servants, spies, and unofficial go-betweens, the invisible hands behind every royal affair, failed marriage, secret tryst, and whispered confession. For every royal touch, there was someone else adjusting the bed curtains. For every love letter, someone else folded the page. And for every time a queen cried into her pillows, someone else changed the linens and said nothing at all. Take the ladies-in-waiting, ostensibly companions. They were often much more, guardians of secrets, managers of moods, and sometimes quiet conspirators. They dressed queens for bed, sat with them during lonely afternoons, and listened as they poured out frustrations about cold husbands, absent lovers, or inconvenient pregnancies. Some acted as liaisons, arranging secret meetings or slipping notes between handmaidens. Others were spies in disguise, feeding information back to rivals or even foreign courts. One of the most infamous was Lady Sarah Churchill, close confidant to Queen Anne of England. Their relationship was deeply emotional, possibly romantic, and Sarah wielded enormous influence over Anne's decisions, both public and private. But when their bond soured, it shattered the Queen's stability. Sarah didn't just leave, she published private letters, exposing Anne's vulnerabilities to a hungry public. Intimacy weaponized. Then there were the valets and pages, especially those serving kings. They dressed the monarch, tended to his meals, and escorted him to bed. And if the king had company, the valet was the one who saw her in and out. One wrong look, one overheard whisper, and the entire court could change overnight. Some pages became confidants, others became informants. During Louis XV's reign, a rotation of trusted valets managed the comings and goings of his many mistresses at the hidden doors of the Parc aux Sires, his private pleasure estate. These servants weren't just passive, they were essential, managing time slots, ensuring silence, and keeping the king's taste neatly catalogued. Perhaps your heirs will never know. Perhaps they'll name buildings and ships and ceremonial fountains after you, never realising you once stood barefoot by a window, trembling from a kiss you weren't supposed to want. But that's all right, because somewhere in the world, maybe even right now, someone is falling into a forbidden embrace, heart racing with the same mix of fear and hope, and maybe, in that moment, they're unknowingly continuing your story. Because the truth is this: palaces don't just house power. They house the entire messy spectrum of human desire. Passion, regret, joy, restraint. The night you met their eyes across the banquet, the morning you couldn't say goodbye, the letter you never sent, the marriage that started in frost and ended in warmth. All of it mattered, even the parts no one believed. And now, as you close your eyes for the final time, you don't see a crown, or a throne, or a tapestry bearing your family's name. You see the candlelight, you feel the touch, you hear the laugh, and in that moment you know the palace remembers, and so will someone else. And now, with the palace dimmed and the candles flickering out, we come to the soft exhale at the end of our long journey. You've wandered through whispered hallways and creaking four-post beds, through centuries of secret letters, forbidden touches, arranged vows, and hearts that beat too fast in too public a place. You've lived a dozen lives: queen, mistress, valet, husband, traitor, confessor. You've witnessed seduction and suspicion, affection and betrayal, births and breakdowns, all framed in brocade and expectation. And now we rest. You've learned what few get to see, that inside every royal bedchamber, beneath all the gold and ceremony, lived something stubbornly, beautifully human. Not myths, not marble, just people, flawed, frightened, impulsive, aching. Some were clever, some cruel, many lonely. All of them, in their own way, reaching for connection in a place designed to isolate them. Whether through a glance across a ballroom or a letter folded under a pillow, they tried. And that effort, that messy, deeply mortal effort, is what echoes loudest in these stories. Maybe you see yourself in some of them, maybe not in their titles or their silks, but in their choices, the ones made out of duty, the ones made out of desperation, the ones made when no one was looking. You don't need a crown to know what it's like to want someone you shouldn't, or to stay when your heart already left, or to risk everything for a kiss you'll only get once. So tonight, as you lie back and let the quiet settle around you like velvet, know this: every palace holds secrets, but none greater than the ones you carry in your own bones. Love, lust, memory, regret. They are not royal, they're just real. And in the hush of history, it's the real that lingers longest. Sleep well, dream softly, and remember, your story matters too.